And we are live. Welcome, everybody on YouTube. My name is Dave, as you probably already know. Dorias lives, and we are covering a very interesting topic tonight. Obviously, you know my background: investigator, psychologist, student, and musician. With me, I've got Nodge and Steve, aka the Dark Knight Detective. And they put it over to them to give you a little bit of a rundown about what they're out and all about. Over to you, Steve.
Hi there, my name's Steve Yarwood. I'm a long-time UFO research investigator, also paranormal investigator. I'm a healthcare professional, sci-fi enthusiast, music producer, and a Reiki healer.
Nodge.
Over to you, Nodge.
Thank you very much, guys. Hi, everybody. My name's Nodge. I'm the other one. Basically, I'm the one that Steve and Dave sort of wheel out for anything sort of analytical or sciencey. I'm a commercial analyst by profession. I've also worked in digital technology, and I've got a degree in earth sciences, physics, and economics, and other bits and pieces. I'm interested in all the things that Steve and Dave are interested in, but they usually wheel me out as the sane one, which will perhaps tell you how insane they are.
That does give quite a good idea about what's going out at this neck of the woods, it has to be said, yeah. Okay, so tonight we're going to be covering the Roswell Incident. I'm sure a lot of people know about the Roswell Incident, but we'll be covering some parts maybe that some people don't know about the Roswell Incident, and running it from there. So, Steve, do you want to give us a little bit of a rundown about what went on?
Well, the brief intro I would say to Roswell is that during a thunderstorm in early July 1947, something crashed in the New Mexico desert about 80 miles northwest of the town of Roswell. Excuse me. The United States Army Air Force issued a press release that they had secured a flying disc. And from that moment, it was either the start of the biggest mistake, the biggest hoax, or the biggest cover-up in the history of UFOs. Now, this is no easy talk due to the amount of witnesses, twists and turns, and the ambiguity of evidence, hearsay and witness testimony. And in no way is what we're going to present tonight the definitive story. And as I always say, whenever I do a talk or an interview, please have an open mind. Listen to what is said. And if this piques your interest, then go and have a look at it yourself and make your own mind up.
Of course, now it didn't start at Roswell, as we all know. There was lots of sightings going on beforehand that date back a good way, many years before Roswell, which hopefully Nodge will give us a rundown on. Can you go over some of that, please, Nodge?
Absolutely. I mean, my thesis, everybody, is that Roswell doesn't exist in a vacuum. A lot of people talk about Roswell as if it is the definitive and the index case of ufology, but Steve and Dave will both tell you that that is absolutely not true. In fact, things have been seen over the skies since time immemorial. One of the earliest recorded cases, and I make a note of these, I'm interested in very early cases, so a few early cases to whet everybody's appetite is 214 BC. The Roman author Livy reported Navum Specium Dicelo ad Fulcissa, which is shining ships from the sky over Rome. So over the Roman Empire, lights were seen on several occasions, sometimes on the eve or the aftermath of a battle, sometimes just in ordinary times in the empire. Other cases are things like the angel hair incident, where the Roman historian Cassius Dio recorded, and there were other witnesses to this, fine silver rain from a very clear sky over the Forum of Augustus. Now, there was actually evidence from this. Witnesses used the material to make and adorn coinage, but the silver that fell from the sky disappeared or dissolved after 4 days. Perhaps the most famous medieval incident is known as the Nuremberg sighting, which took place on the 14th of April, 1561, when the citizens of Nuremberg beheld a very frightful spectacle. The sky appeared to fill with cylindrical objects which were red, black, orange, blue, and globes emerged and began to fight one another. So what they witnessed was some sort of battle. Now, this event was so widely witnessed by the citizens of Nuremberg, so widely witnessed, and it was so well known in the city that it's actually depicted in a woodcut by Hans Glaser And it's one of the first images known of a UFO incident, somewhat predating dodgy 16mm footage, it must be said. There are all sorts of incidents that predate Roswell, but certainly in the early 20th century, just before the industrial age and aircraft kick in, because let's not forget, it would have been very easy in the days before aircraft to say, well, this is so odd because nothing else was in the sky. So there've been a number of sightings all over the world. One of my favorites is the Ganseong-gun shiny bowl over the clear skies of South Korea, which took place on the 26th of September 1609. Apparently, the thing that stands out about this sighting was that the shiny bowl that they saw was the size of a city and made a thunderous sound that shook heaven and earth. Now, it appeared tilted as if to land and then rose over the skies as if it was in some kind of trouble, which presumably was what the thunderous explosion was about. It was recorded as being fast as an arrow. There have been all sorts of other cases, which I could bore everybody silly with all night, but a few of my favourites are, in 1909, skip forward 3 centuries now, strange moving lights over Otago, New Zealand, strange moving lights, solid bodies in the sky. We move on then through the 20th century, and I won't steal Steve's thunder because he'll tell you about this stuff, but we get into the Second World War era when the Foo Fighters were seen by various World War II pilots. This phrase describes small, metallic, often colourful spheres that all sorts of pilots and crew saw, so named by the US 415th Night Fighter Squadron originally, but they were seen throughout the 1940s. The thing is that ufology, as Steve will tell you, and believe me, he is an expert. You've got a genuine expert here tonight, will tell you that a lot of UFO sightings can be explained as natural phenomenon. I must say that at the outset, as the group's rationalists, they can be identified as aircraft, meteors, stars, planets, satellites, especially the ISS, it must be said, weather balloons, light phenomena, mirages, and Fowler Morgana, which is the strange effect you see over a desert. Fewer than 10% of reported sightings remain unexplained after proper investigation. So that real kernel of real mystery is the sort of thing that genuine ufologists are interested in, and people like Steve will follow up. And this is one of the reasons that Roswell is so fascinating, not just because of what happened there, but because for 30 years, in effect, it remained in mothballs until Friedman and co. started to look into the Freedom of Information documents that were released. There's a whole load of theoretical underpinnings to this that I won't bore everybody with, but Dave may just give me a yell further on just to come out with some of the underlying hypotheses that underpin ufology.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good rundown of what's gone before. The higher profile cases do tend to be the ones that stick in people's mind, and because of that, they obviously lend themselves towards being the poster boy for what a lot of people consider to be ufology, or the starting point of ufology at least. And Steve, you've got a little bit of a slideshow you can roll that gives us sort of like an introduction, a prelude to modern ufology. If you'd be so kind as to do that and show the audience what you got going on there.
No problem at all, Dave. Thanks for that little bit of an intro there as well, Nodge, about being an expert. I honestly believe that where ufology is concerned, nobody is experts. I think that what we are journeymen who like to have a look at some of the evidence and then try and make something of it. But, thank you for that. Yeah, modern ufology. Right, let's get on with this. Right, 1936 in the Black Forest in Germany. A German writer, John von Helsing, no relation, describes the discovery of a crashed saucer in the Black Forest near Freiburg in 1936 and says that this technology was taken and combined with the information of the Vril Society had received through channeling Maria Orsich and was made into a further project called the Hannibal Project. Now, for many years towards the end of the war, which we'll probably discuss either later in this or perhaps in another show, is that the Germans did have fantastic flight technology towards the war. The Vril Society, allegedly with this crash ship, did build Hannibal saucers and possibly had something to do with the Foo Fighters, not the rock band, unfortunately, but these little balls of light that flew through the sky in the Second World War. But the only problem with that is it didn't just hassle Allied forces, it also hassled German and Japanese forces. But I'll come to that shortly. From that, we have, oh, hang on a minute, let me just go back one, sorry about that. The Orson Welles War the Worlds radio broadcast of 1938. H.G. Wells' novel War the Worlds was the first story of interplanetary warfare involving Earth. Before his story, previous tales described peaceful beings visiting Earth, but Wells' aliens came with weapons and were ready to take over the Earth for their new home. These aliens who came from Mars had so much power that humans could not stand a chance against them, and in the end it was just a bit of bacteria that killed them. As a direct result of this novel, people began to believe that an alien invasion would mean the termination of mankind. Now, Orson Welles, who was a fantastic, and everyone knows him from his films, but he actually did fantastic work in radio. And he worked with a company called the Mercury Theatre, and they were the top notch in the day of radio theatre. Their on-air broadcast of the version of Wells's novel on Halloween night 1938 began at 8 p.m. And even before the broadcast was through, millions of people were frightened to the point that they cried, prayed, tried to rescue loved ones and called upon ambulances and police. There was even people shooting water towers because they believed they were the invaders of the tripods that was described in the novels. There was nationwide panic like never before. The people perceived this play as being reality, and at the time, radio was the most reliable source of news, and everything was portrayed so realistically. Also, some of the specific places described, for example, street names, were real, and for many people, that really did hit home. From this intense reaction, we can conclude that at this time in history, our culture believed that extraterrestrial life exists and that aliens were capable of travelling to Earth by UFOs to invade our planet.
Okay, well, hang on a minute, Steve. Before you move on to the next one, just before you move on, going back to the Orson Welles thing, yeah. I mean, I think in a way, would you consider that to be some kind of litmus test for the way that people or society in general would actually respond to the news of, I don't know, extraterrestrial biological entities, to Martians, to UFOs, to flying saucers? Is that the kind of response that the humanity, that society, that the theological background basis of civilization would respond to? I mean, I don't know what your take is on that, Nodge. As you look at that and as you hear that effect rippled across society when that radio broadcast went out, does that suggest to you that at least then that mankind or humanity wasn't ready for that kind of information, whether it be true or false, that they weren't ready to hear about life from another planet?
Interesting timing of that broadcast as well, because obviously it was just the year before the Second World War, and it was quite obvious there was going to be some sort of global conflagration. People really weren't used to mass media at this time, and I mean, there's been lots of psychological studies of mass media that show how people respond to it. I mean, it's quite obvious there was never sort of mass hysteria on a national or international scale before mass media. So the prospects of things like radio and later television doing this to people is because of the numbers it was reaching. That's what I find fascinating. Wells plugged into that, didn't he, very, very early on in the game.
Can I just sort of jump in there? Now, I'm going to be really, really apologetic because, one, I'm getting old, and two, my memory's not as good as it used to be. So I can't remember names and places so well. And really, I should have looked up on this because this is a question I should have expected to be asked. But there was actually a person in the United States. Everyone goes on about the Germans in the Second World War using propaganda to get their, the stuff across to the public. It was actually developed, the propaganda, by the Americans. Now, when the War of the Worlds broadcast came out, like you say, it was used as a litmus test. Many years later, the Brookings Institute, when they did their report on ufology, which was put forward by NASA to find out what they thought, how the public would feel, this was one of the things that was put forward. Now, the gentleman, like I say, whose name totally escapes me, he used this to sort of say, well, you know what? If this can be used in this way, then we know it nowadays, especially with the Trump organization and stuff like that, as fake news.
Are you talking about Lord Haw-Haw, bro?
No, Lord Haw-Haw was a British. They were confused for it. But it was a guy in America who's actually some kind of psychologist that the American government used, and he said this is the perfect example of how we could use radio to be able to influence people and give information out to people, whether it's true or not. Now, a few years later, this same broadcast was done in a South American country. Now, when Wells did it, he was sort of trotted out the next day, and he was asked to give, like an apology to the Americans to say, "So sorry, shouldn't have done that." But in the South American country, when it was done, I think it was Venezuela, they actually burnt down the radio station, killed about 8 people. So the power of radio in them days was so much. We forget nowadays how it is, because we have news thrown at us all the time on TV, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But one time, what they used to do was turn the radio on, and what they were given on that radio was taken as read. So when they heard that broadcast of War of the Worlds in 1938, they honestly believed that they were being attacked by aliens.
Okay, so and we move on to the next stage in the pre-modern history of ufology, which is
it's the Battle of Los Angeles.
The Battle of Los Angeles.
That is, God, I've lost my notes on that now. I don't believe this. Basically, at the time, they were just coming over the facts of what had happened at Pearl Harbor in the United States, and because there was this massive fear of something going to happen again on the mainland, everybody was like a highlighted sort of sense of urgency. On the night in question, there was a massive blackout which covered a massive area from Bakersfield South to San Diego, covering Boulder City, Las Vegas. And after 8 o'clock at night, literally all that part of the coast and that part of the country was in darkness. Excuse me. This continued on till about 3 p.m. And as Los Angeles went dark amongst considerable confusion and uncertainty, the Interceptor Command announced that it's not a practice blackout, and that radar was indicating the approach of enemy air radars. Excuse me. This was flashed on the statewide teletype at 7:35, and police said that the signal indicated the presence of unidentified airplanes approaching Los Angeles from the sea. Now, a lot of stuff was going on at the sea at that time, because there was a lot of Japanese submarines allegedly seen in the area at that point. So if they were thinking submarines were there, perhaps there was something like the aircraft carriers which were flying planes off as well. Anti-aircraft and machine gun gunners scrambled to their weapons at Fort MacArthur, which was promptly placed on alert basis. Reports that the sound of gunfire could be heard could not be verified from listening posts at the beach or at the harbour. Definite indication that the Interceptor Command meant business by calling for the blackout was contained in a statement from a spokesperson who said, "There are planes over the south of Los Angeles that are identified. The area will be blacked out until we can identify them." When asked if Army airplanes had been sent aloft to contact these aircraft, the spokesman said, "You can assume there have been." Thousands of Angelinos listening for straining ears for sounds of aircraft were unable to distinguish sounds of motors. However, a few minutes after the blackout was ordered, the flashing of what appeared to be Army searchlights was visible in the higher portions of Los Angeles, 25 minutes from the waterfront. And headquarters of the 4th Interceptor Command, calling the blackout a success, said that a report of the unidentified planes were in the vicinity of Los Angeles. Now, the picture you see there is the searchlights going on the object that was seen over Los Angeles at the time. Now, people were saying, oh, it must have been a large weather balloon. Now, indications on the night, there was wind which was in a certain direction at a certain speed. But at one point, this hovered for a good few minutes, which if there was wind about, no balloon is going to hover about for any length of time. It's going to go with the wind. Eventually, it moved off. The ACAT guns which were firing at it, there was something like 25,000 rounds which were fired that night, allegedly hitting it, but nothing, it didn't come down, nothing. There was bits of shrapnel that fell to the floor. Some people were killed by falling debris. Some people died of heart attacks. And this thing just followed off around the coast and then disappeared into the sunset.
Okay, so with people like giving, like we say, explanations, so on, like that being a weather balloon, would the presence of thermoclines not have meant that it couldn't have stayed in position for any even remote length of time, saying that it hovered? and that it was kept in the searchlight. Was there a particular length of time it was caught in the searchlights? How many witnesses were there? There was a lot of people that saw this firsthand, or because of the blackout, were a lot of people obviously indoors staying out of the way?
No, there was thousands of witnesses to it. It's one of they'd actually reckon this is one of the biggest cases for the amount of people who have actually seen it. There was there've been interviews on for many people for many years, for people who were kids at the time, who have said, you know what, this has stayed with me forever. We could see this thing. It just looked like a huge disc that was hovering there. As you were saying about the thermoclines, this appears to have been at a certain altitude where that would not have been any matter to it at all. It was held in the spotlights for a specific length of time, which I think was somewhere in the region of 20 minutes. The amount of stuff that was pounded at it, people said it looked like things were hitting it and just bouncing off, and it just disappeared.
And Steve, it's worth mentioning, isn't it, that this is one of the few incidents where there's been a response, because obviously the incident was put down to war panic, but in fact, it was recorded on the night that 1,440 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition were directed against these mysterious things that were recorded as being very slow to well over 200 miles an hour without any losses. One of the things that fascinates me is very often, you know, we think about UFO sightings. They're very often anonymous, they're very often in out-of-the-way places, but here was an incident in the limelight of wartime America that they actually fired live ordnance at.
Yeah, but and also at one point they did think there was a couple of downed aircraft that had been hit, because although we're seeing on this picture, there's a massive object. Yeah. There was lots of smaller ones during the night, which people said that it was like small aircraft that were buzzing about. So it's not just this one thing. There was a lot of other things that was going on at the same time as well. The only thing that I must say is, and obviously, you know, to have an argument about anything in regards of ufology, you have to see it from both sides. Otherwise, you just become somebody who sort of says, it's a UFO and that's it. I try to sort of not label myself in that. But this photograph here, on further investigation, when they've actually looked into this, they can't find the original negative. They've even said that there may have been parts of this that have been touched up. Now, I don't know. All I'm doing is I'm going off the picture that is bandied about all over the place. The original negative can no longer be found, so I'm giving that information out as well, so I can't be seen as being biased. But for me, okay, the photograph, it could be contentious. We don't know. But for the amount of witness testimony on the night, there's definitely something that was not right there and shouldn't have been there. And even the Japanese, when after the war, when they said, look, what did you have over Los Angeles at this time? They went, we weren't even there.
Nothing. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, during the Japanese were sending balloons to try and cause disruption over to the USA. So I'm pretty sure that would have come across as being a potential. But yeah. Another point would be, as you look at that there, Nodge, and with the photographic background, at first glance, I mean, I know it's difficult, of course, because you are just looking at a print rather than the negative. But as you look at that, do you see areas where the touching up could have been done, where it's more likely?
I was just about to say, Dave, and everybody listening, that I started life as a reprographic photographer doing architectural and lithographic work in a technical photographic studio. And this was well before my time. I started in 1978, but at the time that these photographs would have been produced, it was quite normal to touch up negatives, not for the purposes of misleading people, but for the purposes of correcting things like chromatic aberration, over and under exposure, and actually bringing out the detail, especially in either low light or very contrasty situations. So what I'm seeing there is a photo that's been printed by a printer. In the old days, it wasn't just about the negative. Very often the negative contained the information, but it was the printer that would bring it out. There's something called burning in that printers would do, especially in the press, where photographs have been taken in very poor situations or very quickly or very panically. You know, the printer actually had to either doctor the negative to bring out the features or actually bring it out during printing. So this is nothing unusual either then or now, because people do the same with digital photography. Again, not to mislead, but to bring out details, particularly on a dark night like this, where you had an area of high contrast. I mean, the lights in the sky there over the craft would have been, say, 1,500 times brighter than the shadow areas that you can see at the bottom of the shot.
Yeah. Okay. So that's par for the course would have been what they would do regarding photography would be the burning in techniques, the techniques that you've discussed. So given that being the case, that print, as we look at it, doesn't suggest that there's been anything out of the ordinary. It's not been tampered with per se, and without the negative to analyze, and even with the negative to analyze, it stands as its own right as a photograph.
Oh no! I mean, the one thing that strikes me is this is a typical press printer's sort of photograph, insofar that it's printed on what I would have called grade 4 paper. It's in order to get the news out at the time, because obviously, you know, newspaper print at the time was just, it was, you know, there was a small gamut, if you like, of black and white tones available to them. They made the images very contrasty to actually bring out the main features of the photograph. So you see where the beams are actually sort of going up, and you can see the anti-aircraft fire there. Those wouldn't have been nearly as contrasted with the night sky when they were actually photographing them. But this is a normal practice, if you like, for a photographic print in a newspaper. Okay, so what have we got next on the list, Steve? Moving forward from the Battle of Los Angeles.
Okay, we're going to talk now quickly about Foo Fighters. Obviously, this is a big subject, which was at the end of World War II. Well, from the end of 1944, they became quite prevalent. World War II pilots on both sides of the conflict reported Foo Fighters, bright unidentified flying objects that move in the sky in a strange manner, and assumed often that the Foo Fighters were secret weapons employed by the enemy. The name Foo came from the American cartoon strip called Smokey Stover, whose catchphrase was, "Where there's Foo, there's fire." And then the term was coined for this unusual phenomenon by a radar operator in the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, Donald J. Mayers. Originally called effing Foo Fighters, but eventually cleaned up to just Foo Fighters. The Allies also called them Kraut fireballs, and they were often described as fiery red, orange, or white, and as if under intelligent control. And these fireballs would play with the aircraft, manoeuvring wildly, following the aircraft closely, executing ridiculous turns, and then just vanishing. Not once was a single Foo Fighter shot down, and only after the war did the Allies find out that the Germans and Japanese pilots were reporting similar things and believed them to be weapons of the Allies. Just before Christmas 1944, the New York Times broke the story on this so-called new German weapon, and here's just a couple of the reported sightings. In 1944, Germany, Hagenau, on December the 22nd, 1944, Lieutenant David McFalls of the US 415th Night Fighter Squadron was over Hagenau, Germany, and at 6 a.m. he saw two huge bright orange lights climbing towards the plane. McFalls dived, banked, and turned his plane, but the UFO stuck with him for 2 minutes and then peeled off and then blinked out. And in North Korea, Wonsan, 3 Japanese Zeros engaged 2 daylight discs in a dogfight. 1 Zero was shot down and the UFOs flee into space.
Okay, and next along.
Sorry, I was going to have a quick description then about them, but never mind. Right, this takes us over to Kenneth Arnold then, who was known as probably the father of modern ufology. Kenneth Arnold was on his way through. Hang on, let me just get my notes back into line. It would be easier if I did it that way. Right, okay. 1947 was probably the big bang for ufology. Some people think it was the year that UFOs came of age. Personally, I don't believe it, to coin a phrase by Arthur C. Clarke. What I do believe is that this is the point in history where the media actually took the subject on board and has run with it ever since. UFOs will never come of age, as it would always be a mystery. Not the ones we can eventually identify, but that minuscule percentage that we can't. And the experts in many fields shake their heads and say, buggered if I know. I suppose that's why the subject is still around today. Theories and opinions never go out of fashion. Experts appear to argue if their point is more valid than someone else's, or even just to debunk the subject entirely. Whatever the case, almost everyone will point the finger to the year 1947 and say that's the year flying saucers were born. Though not technically true for 2 very good reasons. One, the term saucer had been used before, as Nodge can probably say from his historical mention earlier on. And 2, the saucer aspect was used as a description of movement and not shape. is, of course, from that fateful interview that Kenneth Arnold had witnessed his UFO sighting that gripped the media and brought a new piece of terminology into everyday use. On the 24th of June 1947, Kenneth Arnold was the lone pilot of a Corsair Air A2 on a business trip when he heard of a $5,000 reward for the discovery of a US Marine Corps C-46 transport airplane that had crashed near Mount Rainier in Washington. Just before 3 p.m, he noticed a flash of reflected light north of Mount Rainier. He noticed whatever it was flying in a chain formation and initially thought of a flock of geese. He quickly changed his mind when he weighed up the height, speed and reflectivity and thought they may be experimental aircraft, except he couldn't make out a tail on any of these 9 objects. Based on the observations by Arnold, the objects were between 140 to 280 feet in size, moving at a speed of over 1,700 miles an hour, and this was 3 times faster than the aircraft from 1947 was capable of achieving. Arnold reported the sighting to the airport manager Al Baxter, and before long, most of the airfield staff knew the story. Arnold was interviewed by the press the following day. And starting on June the 27th, the newspapers began using the words flying saucer and flying disc to describe the objects that Arnold had reported. Now, if you look at that picture there, it's not so much a disc, it's more of a crescent-shaped aircraft. Now, if we look at that and then look at one of the Nazi craft which was being developed in the Second World War, which is the Horten 229 or the Horten wing developed by the Horten brothers, there's a slight, if you can see it, I certainly do, look to it where it looks very similar, especially, you know, when he was considering he was quite a few miles away from it. Now, these Horten 229s could possibly have been captured by the Allies, certainly at the end of the war when a lot of stuff was being taken from Operation Paperclip, and some of the technology was being reverted over. And for me, it's quite possible that the so-called flying saucers that Kenneth Arnold saw was in fact Allied or American test flights of an aircraft developed from the Horten 229.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you would. It's not a stretch of the imagination to see that they both look very, very similar. The likelihood of it being in over Mount Rainier, it has to be called into question, though. I don't know your thoughts, Nodge.
With regards to the specific incident, David, I wouldn't say I'm not really qualified, but I'll say one thing as the sort of resident rationalist here. That I know that in piloting circles, that a pilot with 2,000 hours in is considered to be a capable pilot. It must be said that Arnold was a highly experienced and highly capable pilot with over 9,000 flying hours, and he was a search and rescue flyer, so he was a good pilot. This is a man who would have been less likely to misidentify something, even if it was what we would call, you know, weird crap. So the question I would ask was he a credible witness? And the answer is wholeheartedly yes.
Yeah, this is going to be a man that's going to know phenomena. He's going to know cloud formations. He's going to be able to recognize weather balloons. He's going to be able to recognize any kind of environmental phenomena that might be going on. He's going to know other aircraft. He's going to be fully aware of what he might come across, light aberrations, apparitions. He's going to be absolutely clued in on what's going around. So when he says he sees the object that he's described, the object in the pictures that Steve showed a second ago, then he will have known the difference between ostensibly a Delta Wing craft as the Horten 229 or that craft there, which can't be described as anything other than being almost futuristic, especially for 1947.
Absolutely. I mean, the one thing to say, obviously, even with the trained pilot, is about the relative kinetics of movement. And even an experienced pilot looking at something that's doing 2, 4, 600 miles an hour Mark 1 is going to have problems actually identifying shape, particularly in poor light. So where there's a slight resemblance, as Steve says, it is an interesting correlation, isn't it?
Absolutely. So off the back of obviously that famous sighting over Washington there, the next big event is obviously Roswell. It's the crash in New Mexico, July 1947, an event which rippled across the world, maybe not then, but certainly many decades later, and a big study point for both historians, ufologists, paranormal investigators, sci-fi buffs. This is the big one in the eyes of the UFO community, in the eyes of civilization, society. This is one that keeps rearing its head. There are so many parts to it, so many facets to the story of the Roswell crash that we're going to try to go over. So many different things that make it the one that won't go away. And I think you can give us a rundown of this, Steve. Can you not?
Yeah, I've got another slideshow for you, so we can go through some of the salient points, and then from there, if there's anything you want to ask, I'll, like I say, I'm no expert. I'm just a bit knowledgeable about some of it, so I'll try and make head and tail of it if that's any better for you. Right, okay, so the events of leading up to the 7th of July, which I should have actually done it as that, in 1947, which led up to the so-called famous or infamous Roswell Incident. I don't know why my mic muted, but there we go. Okay, so here's a map of, and I'm saying, crash sites. Simple reason is that when the original Roswell came to light, there was only one crash site, and over the years, with the different timelines, different witness experiences, there seems to have been 2 crash sites. Some actually mentioned 3. I tried to sort of get away from it. I mean, I think 2 crash sites is pushing it, but we'll take it from there. Okay, so if you can see on your screen there, it actually mentions, first of all, the Brazil crash site, which is just a bit northwest from Roswell, and over to the western side, you see crash site 2, which is on the plains of San Agustin, which this map sort of actually does mention there.
Of course, the Brazil crash site is the famous one, the one that everybody knows.
This is what we're practically sticking to, because the problem with Roswell is that it has so many different timelines, because over the years, so many people have come to light to say, this has happened, that has happened, I saw this, I saw that. The only problem is that quite a lot of them have been proven to be telling porkies, shall we say. And Roswell has become such a cottage industry that people want a piece of it. So what I've tried to do is get a timeline made up of all the timelines which are known, find what I think are quite shall we say, what are more believable, and try to get it into something concise so that we can walk through it from start up to practically the modern day, and take it from there. There is a mention of certain elements where these people have sort of told ridiculous lies, but we will come to that later on. But hopefully what we're going to discuss will bring us forward and give us a good idea of actually what was going on at the time in 1947. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely fine.
Okay, so this is what I would class as a shortened timeline of events, which unfortunately will seem like forever, but if I went all the way through, it would be here till probably Monday morning.
Because the truth of it is that a lot did actually go on, more than a lot of people might even be aware of, and more than what is actually closely reported in the media. This is an in-depth case.
It really is. And to be honest, I mean, I don't think we're going to do it justice tonight. I think it would take us sort of saying, well, we're going to do a live broadcast from 10 o'clock in the morning till midnight. And even then, I don't think we touch the subject. But this, considering it's the first one that we're doing tonight on regards of UFOs, I think it's probably the one that we would need to get out of the way, just for people to sort of say, well, we've heard about Roswell. As my missus often says, like if I'm watching a documentary, she say, bloody hell, Roswell again. And that's how it's got nowadays. People are so sick of hearing about it, but I'm hoping to bring this to you to sort of give you a little bit more than the usual stuff that comes up on TV about a farmer finding this, saying that, and then that was it. So hopefully, like I say, this will pique a little bit of interest anyway. That's pretty much all I can say.
Yeah, the danger of it turning into an industry, Roswell, isn't there? But the actual interesting, yeah.
It really has, and so people see that, and straight away they dismiss a lot of the facts that's gone on. And you could put that down to, is it some sort of disinformation on a grand scale? Because people would see this and say, why do we need to believe in that? All I do is turn up to go and see what I believe is the area where the UFO crashed, and I came back with a T-shirt. Simple as.
Yeah.
Okay, so on Wednesday, July the 2nd in 1947, Mr. and Mrs. Dan Wilmot see a saucer-shaped object fly over their house in Roswell, flying off to the northwest at a high rate of speed. Now, in most most of the reports of Roswell, this isn't mentioned. And you'll probably find a lot of other stuff on the way. You'll think, oh, I never knew that. And I'm hoping that's the case, that it isn't stuff that you've heard, because if it does pique your interest, then I'm hoping you do go out and say, you know what, I want to read a bit more about this, do a bit of research yourselves. Anyway, on Friday, July the 4th, 1947, Warrant Officer Robert Thomas arrived on the first of the special flights into Roswell. Remember that, the first of special flights. William Woody and his father watch a flaming object fall towards the ground north of Roswell. And during a thunderstorm near Corona, New Mexico, Mac Brazel hears a thunderclap that sounds more like an explosion. Other people in the area report the same observation. And at 11:27 p.m, radar sites are watching the object, as they have been for a few days, on screen, and it appears to pulsate and then explode in a starburst. The operators believed it was at this point that the object crashed. Jim Ragsdale and his girlfriend, Trudy Truelove, yeah, like I said there, I'm not making this up, that is actually somebody's name, saw a flash of light while they were out kissing and canoodling on a campsite as something roared overhead and passed by. Ragsdale knows something has struck the ground near where they are camping. Now, one of the accounts about Jim Ragsdale is that he took his girlfriend, Trudy Truelove, with a flashlight, which the batteries were a bit dicky on, and went and actually saw this object literally sticking into the ground at a 30-degree angle, and then decided to make it quickly out of there because he thought this wasn't where they needed to be. He felt something was wrong and went back to the site where they were camping.
So leading him to be the first observant of the crash disk.
Technically, yeah, but unfortunately over the years, Jim Ragsdale has become one of the most, shall we say, along with a couple of others that we'll come to, one of the most, shall we say, unreliable witnesses.
Okay.
And this is the unfortunate thing about Roswell, that everybody sort of come out to get a piece of the pie, because you've got to remember, as you know from yourself, in the 90s, you know, you used to have UFO magazine and stuff like that, and it was a case of like everybody wanted to make some money out of it. So while us poor sods were out there slogging our guts out and sending reports into UFO magazine to say, look what we've been doing, in the next breath, they're saying they're in Roswell, New Mexico with the tank tops and sandals, saying that they're at some convention there while us mooks are doing all the hard work. But that's another story. But basically, yeah, over the years, people have wanted a little bit of it and they've added stuff to it. But the two main protagonists I shall come to later on. On Saturday, July the 5th in 1947, a friend of Mac Brazel's, this is another one who came forward years later, find the remains of a crashed saucer. He quickly leaves the area and tells no one until many years later. Also, a group of archaeologists find the object's impact site. One heads off to find the nearest telephone to call Sheriff Wilcox, who on receiving the call alerts the fire department. The site is about 35 miles north of Roswell. A truck with Dan Dyer aboard responds and is escorted by members of the Roswell Police Department. At 5:30 a.m, the military move in with a specialist team, including Robert Thomas, who we mentioned earlier, to recover the craft, and on arriving, find civilians are already there and escort them from the area. 5 bodies are retrieved and the site is cleaned and secured in 6 hours. Because of the previous night's rain, Mac Brazel ventures out to inspect the pastures and is accompanied by his neighbour's son, William Proctor. They come across the debris field with metal plastic-like beams, foil and string. The depth of the debris is enough to put the sheep off from crossing it. Robert Thomas and his crew leave the impact site and the recovered bodies are now in lead-lined body bags. Only highest clearance is allowed on site and the guards are told to face outwards and keep anyone away. And there's a picture there of Mac Brazel.
I think it remains to be seen as well as also worth note that the levels of security clearance are far above and beyond what a lot of people might be aware of, even well above the level of the president. Now, of course, there is levels of security clearance that are for different sectors, different bodies, different departments, and so on. But security, it comes in many, many forms. This kind of information, this kind of security clearance would have been very, very high at this time, especially so close to the end of the Second World War.
It would have been ridiculous. In fact, you know, when well, it's not so much mentioned later on, but Sheridan Cavett, who was the counterintelligence officer there, was a good friend of Jesse Marcel's, who eventually came out with some of the details. And their friendship ended over this because basically Cavett put a report in which basically made Jesse Marcel look at a complete tool. And it was all down to the fact that he had a job to do. It was nothing personal, but how can you not take it personal after that? And everything, as you know, is compartmentalized. Some people know one thing, some people know another. Not everybody knows everything.
Okay, so something's come down, bodies have been found, but it doesn't end there, because obviously with the bodies comes the need to move the bodies, to dispose of the bodies, and still maintain that level of secrecy.
Oh, but there's all sorts. It's like wheels within wheels, puzzles within riddles. John McBoyle, radio KSWS in Roswell, attempts to reach the site. He phones Lydia Sleppy to report an object that looks like a crushed dishpan. She overhears an argument on the other end of the phone. Then McBoyle says, "Oh, I've made a mistake. Forget what I've said." Sleppy then attempts to put a message out via the teletype, but that message is intercepted by the FBI in Dallas and is told not to complete the transmission. Now, back at the impact site, Melvin Brown is in the back of a truck and sneaks a look under the tarpaulin and sees the bodies of the alien flight crew. He describes them as small, with large heads and yellow or orange skin. Glenn Dennis, who's the mortician at the Roswell mortuary, receives a call about small caskets. And then shortly after, Dennis receives yet another call about embalming and preparing a body that has been in the elements. Dennis suspects that there's been a fatal crash involving a VIP. Shortly after the calls, Dennis, who is also an ambulance driver, takes an injured airman back to the Air Force Base and sees 3 trucks or ambulances with strange debris in the back of them. The bodies arrive at the Air Force Base and Dr. Jesse Johnson pronounces them dead. 2 doctors who are not assigned to the base but who arrive on one of the special flights that we mentioned earlier conduct an autopsy on the bodies. Brazel shows his neighbours, the Proctors, some of the debris, who suggests he should take the debris into Roswell to show the sheriff. Meanwhile, back inside the base, Glenn Dennis is confronted by 2 officers. A red-haired captain tells him he's seen and heard nothing, and if he opens his mouth, they'll be picking his bones out of the desert. A nurse that he knows sees Dennis and tells him to get out of there. Military bases along the west coast are on standby in case any flying discs return. Later that evening, Mac Brazel removes a large piece of debris from the range and stores it in a barn about 3 miles north of the crash site. The bodies at the airbase are sealed in a long crate and left in a guarded hangar overnight.
Okay, so there's obviously events are moving along pretty quickly, aren't they? Obviously, but well out of the way of the public eye. But I've just said there that the entire country's on standby now. This is obviously off the back of, not just off the back of the Second World War, but would you say it's also because of the scare, the battle over Los Angeles, and because of the Kenneth Arnold incident? What type of effect do you think that will have had on it? I mean, what's your take on that, Nodge? The fact that there would have been some kind of level of predisposition for the government, or at least for the Air Force, the military, to have a particular mindset. Does it appear that they had a plan in place to silence everybody, to stop this information getting out?
I think what you were looking at with regard to the original incident, Dave, was the fact that at a time of heightened security concern, just after the Second World War, and let us not forget that the Cold War is just around the corner, that already, the overtures from Soviet Russia, from China, are not good for the United States. So already there's a lot of fear, a lot of things that would have been routinely either dismissed or put down to routine investigations were usually stamped ATS, above top secret at the time, because in a lot of cases, things that might just have slipped through the net were being treated as a security risk. So I think that's a part of it. There is a sort of a mass psychology to this, but not just with regard to the witnesses, but also with regard to the way that states and governments react to these sorts of incidents. And I think you see this in Roswell, and you see it particularly in the aftermath to Roswell that Steve will go through later with regard to the work of Friedman and the other ufologists. insofar that the freedom of information claims that went in were extensive and released a lot of documents. I think what you're looking at here is security concerns. This might have been a prelude or a threat to the Second World War.
Yeah. And of course, the sheer amount of fear that's going about at the time and paranoia within the governing bodies is obviously going to sort of instigate a certain narrative to the way that they deal with this kind of thing, for sure.
It's a mindset, Dave. All governments think in a certain way. It's a bit like a collective culture. You know, the way they say that British people react in one way, German and French people and American people react in another. There are sort of behaviours that typify certain sorts of government agencies, and particularly when you're looking at the military agencies, who are very careful about controlling evidence, controlling witnesses, making sure that it doesn't, you hear this phrase, don't you, need to know. Well, I think in these circles, with these incidents, what you're looking at here is a real fear of the unknown.
Well, let's not forget, though, at this time, while we're sort of saying that it's possibly a down-flying saucer, that they were also considering that it could be possibly a down Soviet or Japanese aircraft as well. So there was a lot of things going on, because, like you say, it was that fear after the end of the war, and it was getting up to the point of the fear of the Reds under the bed as well. So there was also a lot going on there. Yeah,
absolutely, and that is going to have driven even if they could at this time. Even if they could, and of course the events that are going to transpire, which obviously we'll go over in a sec, prove this point. Even if they could release the information, if it were true on face value of it being a crash saucer, the sheer fear factor of invasion, as you said before, the worry, the concern, and if they couldn't describe it as that, they were limited to the response that they could give because of the fear of the Soviets, because of the fear from the East. So the hands were tied in many ways, but not in every way, Steve.
No, what you've got to look at is, remember, the Americans came into the Second World War. We sort of blew the bugle and they came running in. And it was a case of like, we come in, we won the war, we've got the technology, we've got the aircraft, we've got the pilots. And if this was actually the case, that something was incursing onto their airspaces that they had no control over, no aircraft that could match it, and basically they were out on a limb because these things were outmaneuvering them left, right, and centre, they no longer had that, shall we say, that control of the skies. That was a massive thing for the Air Force to take in, because they were somebody who honestly believed that whatever they could do, they were the best at. And when confronted with these type of craft, that wasn't the case.
Okay, so we've got the bodies. We're at the stage where the bodies have been retrieved, and we're an entire different stage, a different chapter of the story develops just on this case alone, because of what happens regarding the hospital, the sheriff's department, the radio stations, and everything else. Do you want to go through that?
Yeah, this is the big lead up now as everything sort of comes in. So we've ascertained now that there is possibly two crash sites, one which they've already come in and cleared up, and the other one that William Brazel's found. So we know there's two crash sites there. We're going to ignore the other one, which people are saying where there's possibly yet a third UFO tying into the Aztec UFO case. We'll ignore all that and carry on with our little timeline. So on Sunday, July the 6th, 1947, Matt Brazel gets up early to drive 75 miles into Roswell. So remember that. I mean, I'm based in Oldham. So if anybody was to say there was an Oldham UFO crash and it was 75 miles away, I'd be looking at somewhere like Birmingham. So it would be no longer like the Roswell one. So it is like a massive distance away. Anyway, okay. It shows this daybreak to Sheriff Wilcox, who, contrary to some reports, is quite excited about the discovery. 11:30 a.m, Glenn Dennis locates the nurse who told him to get out and arranges to meet for lunch at the officers' club. Now, I find this slightly suspect straight away, that he's been into this into the airfield. He's upset some people there anyway. This nurse has told him to get out, but he wants to go and meet her in the officers' club. Well, that's probably just me. I don't know. I've probably watched too many spy films. Wilcox, whilst waiting for the military to arrive, sends two deputies to the ranch to have a look at the debris field. William Woody and his father attempt to find where the object they saw come down had crashed, but on arrival find that the roads are blocked and guarded by the military. Frank Joyce, an announcer and reporter for station KGFL, calls in on Wilcox and asks if there's anything newsworthy going on. Wilcox refers him over to Brazel. Colonel William Blanchard, commanding officer of the 509th Bomb Group stationed at Roswell, orders Air Intelligence Officer Jesse Marcel to investigate. Now, you've got to remember, the 509th Bomb Group was the only atomic bomb group in the world at the time. This was where they sent over the bombs to Japan. So, you know, they weren't idiots who were there. It was a very secure airbase. The people there were on the highest security and probably the highest intelligent people in there, because it was, like I say, the only atomic bomb group at the time in the world.
Top level military installation.
Exactly. You know, it's the creme de la creme. You think of it at the time, when you get to something like atomic level in the late 40s, that's as high as you can go. Marcel, sorry.
It's worth mentioning, Dave and Steve, that what was called Roswell still is. I mean, it's a top-range test track, even now, you know, at Groom Lake. So, I mean, this is not somewhere that's fallen into disuse, even though they may claim it has. Well,
the entire area of New Mexico at that time, it was a bomb test. It was flying new equipment. This was the place that if you had anything that you wanted to hide, and it was top secret, this is where you went to at the time.
Okay, and then it developed into the next developments in the story were?
Marcel then goes to Wilcox's office, who was the sheriff, looks at the debris there and decides it's best then to go to the actual debris field and examine it himself. So Marcel then returns to the base to show Butch Blanchard some of the debris. Blanchard, on seeing it, knows this debris is highly unusual and alerts the higher headquarters. Marcel, Blanchard, and later Sheridan Cavett, who was the counterintelligence officer, all knew this was no balloon. So Marcel then returns to Wilcox's offices with the counterintelligence officer, Sheridan Cavett, who then escorts Brazel back to the debris field near his ranch. On orders from Major General McMullen, Blanchard gets more debris from the sheriff's office and sends it via yet another special flight to Fort Worth. It's then given to Colonel Thomas DuBose, who transports it to Washington, D.C. After Marcel and Cavett leave with Brazel, the two deputies return to say they couldn't find the debris field, but have found a burnt area in one of the pastures. The sand there looked as though it had been turned to glass and looked like a circular object had touched down. At Fort Worth Army Airfield, DuBose and Base Commander Colonel Clark meet the flight from Roswell. They get the small amount of debris and take it to the Command B-26 that'll fly it onto Washington, D.C. and General McMullen. So at this point, you can see there's been a massive chain of events that are going, one aircraft going to one place to meet one set of officials, to another place to meet another set, and then on. It's a massive leaping chain of command as you go along. Because the roads were bad, Marcel, Cavett and Brazel didn't reach the ranch till after dark. They stayed at an old ranch house called the Hines House that was close to the debris field, had a meal of cold beans, then waited for daylight. Marcel runs a Geiger counter over the wreckage Brazel had stored in his cattle shed, but finds no trace of radiation.
I take it that we can put up a picture of the some of the wreckage a little bit later on.
Sorry, missed that one.
I take it we can put up a picture of some of the debris that was allegedly found a little bit later.
Yeah, that's coming because I've got some pictures, like I say, Jesse Marcel with some of the stuff. And as we know, that's a pile of pants anyway. I tried to do these slides so that it's sort of like having the narrative and not interrupt, but we will get to that, don't worry. Sorry about that. Right. On Monday, July the 7th, 1947 at 2 a.m, a flight leaves Roswell Air Force Base for Andrews Army Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. The bodies and some of the debris are on board. Brazel takes the two officers to the crash site. It's a mile long and 200 to 300 feet wide. The debris that they find, it's as thin as newspaper, but it's incredibly strong. Foil that if you crumpled it would unfold without a mark, material resembling bakelite, and plastic like beams with symbols on it. And over the years, we've been told, because more and more witnesses have come forward, that this debris, you could hit it with sledgehammers, you could try with an actually acetylene torch, wouldn't mark it, wouldn't cut it, wouldn't damage it or whatever. So this was like some serious chisel. This is many years before the likes of Nitinol, which is the memory metal which they use in people's glasses and stuff like that, where you can literally fold them up and it pops out. It's many years before that. Roswell KGFL owner Walt Whitmore sends someone to collect Brazel and bring him back to Roswell, as he believes Brazel is going to be hot property. Marcel and Cavett spend the day collecting debris. They load up Marcel's car and Cavitt's jeep and then head home at dusk. Lieutenant Howe returned to duty at Roswell Base to find there had been reports of a downed vehicle and that Marcel and Cavitt had been sent to investigate. By late afternoon, he started hearing about civilian reports, but spent the day just attending to his regular duties. Lieutenant General Twining, Commander of Air Materiel Command, the parent organisation of Wright Field, the next higher headquarters, changes his plans and flies to Alamogordo. Walt Whitmore from KGFL as Brazel stayed the night at his home, where co-owner and newsman Judd Roberts conducts a recorded interview with Brazel, and as it was late, KGFL was off air, so the recording would have to go out the next day. Going to carry on?
Yep.
Okay. Tuesday, July the 8th, 1947 at 2 a.m, Marcel stops us at home. He awakens his wife and son to show them the strange material. He's not broken regulations as it's not yet been classified. His son, Jesse Marcel Jr., then helps his father load the material back into his car, where he then takes it to the base. At 6 a.m, Marcel and Cavitt visit Blanchard and report what they found. Blanchard then calls the Provost Marshal, Edward Easley, to guard the roads around the crash and prevent anyone, not on official business, from entering. Blanchard tells him to pick up Brazel and get him to direct them to the site. Blanchard then calls the 8th Air Force HQ to advise on the new find. By now, no one believes this is material from a Soviet device. 8th Air Force relays the message up the command chain to Strategic Air Command HQ. And at 7:30 a.m, the usual AM meeting was put forward a half hour. Present were Lieutenant Howe, Blanchard, Marcel, Cavitt, Operation Officer Colonel James Hopkins, Supply Officer Lieutenant Ulysses S. Nero, and from Carswell Air Force Base, Fort Worth, Blanchard's boss, Brigadier General Roger Ramey, with his Chief of Staff, Colonel Thomas DeBose. The topics were the impact site and the debris, and samples of the debris were passed around, although no one had the faintest idea of what it was. One of the concerns was they should go public with the information they had, to do that or to not do it, and General Ramey wanted the attention diverted from the more important site north of the town.
I mean, what you have to bear in mind here as well is, of course, that because of the end of the Second World War, and obviously the Soviet Union, the United States, and everything were allies during the Second World War. Yeah. There was Lend-Lease acts. They had a better understanding of one another's technology, one another's military devices, for want of better terminology, because the Cold War hadn't yet begun in earnest. So there was some kind. They weren't as secretive. That was yet to start in what became the full-on Cold War, the proxy wars across the world that involved Asia, and so there was still information. I mean, after the Yalta Conference, any kind of trust between the major powers had been done away with. The reneging on promises made by the West towards the East sort of fed that. But in saying that, they did have an understanding of one another's technology, and if there were any kind of doubts, then the people that we're talking about here would have known. They would have been the people that would have known whether it was new technology, possible technology. At a glance, they could have identified what they were looking at. So we're not dealing with amateurs. We're dealing with professionals that know what they're talking about, not just militarily, but also globally. They understand what's happening.
Yeah, I find this, excuse me, to be probably that point in a bubble where the United States became secretive within itself to certainly to certain parts of the government. We hear now about black projects and stuff like that. I think this was the point where all this happened. I mean, we all know that about Majestic 12 and that this was supposed to be one of the points, but we'll cover Majestic 12 hopefully in a further live cast. But this, I think, is the point where secrecy got to that point where it was like everything started becoming compartmentalized. And I think a lot of the allies as well started, how can you, perhaps distrust is the wrong word, but question perhaps some of the secrecy that the Americans are given, especially on internal subjects.
Do you think, Nodge, that given the results of the war and the end of the war, the end of the way that Second World War ended and the mistrust that went on, had that not occurred, had there been better communication between the different world powers, would, say, an incident like this, would it have been widespread knowledge? Would they have conferred with one another to get details on equipment, on technology, on new materials?
Without being unduly cynical, Dave, about the way that governments operate, I would say no. I think most governments, by their very definition, are secretive and tend to keep any kind of strategic or technology advantages or discoveries to themselves.
Okay, Steve, do you want to bring in the next point, please?
Okay, 7:30 a.m. The recorded interview complete. Whitmore takes Brazel to the airbase. At 9 a.m., Cavett and Master Sergeant William Rickett arrived at the impact site where Rickett is allowed to examine the debris. Whitmore receives a call at KGFL from the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. He's warned that the station will lose its license if he broadcasts the interview. Brigadier General Roger Ramey orders Marcel to Fort Worth. Mac Brazel finds himself beginning a 4-day detention with the military in a guest house on the airbase. He's interrogated, intimidated, denied access to a phone, and given an army physical. At 11 a.m, Colonel Blanchard has Lieutenant Hout write a press release to announce the recovery of a flying disc. By noon, these press releases have been given to both radio stations in the town and both newspapers. Sheriff Wilcox isn't sure what's going on at the crash site and sends 2 more deputies to report back that they were turned away by the military. At 2:26 p.m, the story is now out on the Associated Press newswires. The headline is, "The Army Air Forces here today announced a flying disc has been found." The airbase is inundated with calls, so much so Blanchard is irritated that he's unable to get an outside line. And then at 2:30 p.m, Blanchard decides it's time to get out of there and he goes on leave. He informs his staff to tell any reporters that he is now on leave. Just one sec, let's bring the next one up.
Okay.
Before leaving the base, Colonel Blanchard took Hope personally to Building 84, aka Hangar P3, a B-29 hangar located on the east side of the tarmac, and that it was under heavy guard both outside and inside. Once inside, he was permitted from a safe distance to observe the object just recovered north of town. It was approximately 12 to 15 feet in length, not quite as wide, about 6 feet high and more of an egg shape. The lighting was poor, but its surface did appear metallic. No windows, portholes, wings, tail section or landing gear were visible. Also from a distance, Hout was able to see a couple of bodies under a canvas tarpaulin. Only the heads extended beyond the covering, and he was not able to make out any features. The heads did appear larger than normal, and the contour of the canvas suggested the size of a 10-year-old child. At 12 p.m, the crate that had been sitting in the empty hangar guarded by the MPs is moved out to the bomb pit number 1. Nothing other than weapons has ever been stored in the bomb pit. In Roswell, Floyd Proctor and Lyman Strickland see Matt Brazel under escort by 3 military officers. He ignores both of them, something that he wouldn't have done under normal circumstances. At lunch, the nurse tells Dennis she's sick and wants to return to the barracks. In the course of the meal, she's provided Dennis with an account of what happened and given him a drawing of the alien bodies. You want to continue?
Yeah, carry on.
Okay, under military escort, Brazel is taken into town and into the offices of the Roswell Daily Record. There he gives reporters, including Robin A. Adair and Jason Kellahan from Albuquerque, a new story. He now claims to have found the debris on June the 14th. He also says he's found weather balloon observation devices on 2 other occasions, and what he found is no weather balloon. At 3 p.m, Marcel is told he's off to Fort Worth accompanying the wreckage. One triangular piece about 2 feet long and 3 boxes about the size of shoe boxes, all wrapped in brown paper, seemingly without weight. The specialist flight B-29 takes off for Fort Worth. Calls are coming into Roswell from the world over. And in Fort Worth, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram reporter J. Bond Johnson is told by his editor to drive to Fort Worth base as a saucer is being brought in. Marcel is in Ramey's office with the debris. Ramey asked Marcel to accompany him to the map room to show him exactly where the debris was found. And then when he returns to the original debris, it's gone and has been replaced by a ripped apart weather balloon that has been scattered across the floor. And at 3:55, Roger Ramey announces that the flying disc has been sent onto Wright Field, and more men arrive at the debris field using wheelbarrows to clean it up, and the debris is loaded into trucks and transported to Roswell.
So already here we got wheels within wheels. We got the distrust within the own departments, the cover up within the own departments. And Jesse Marcel was a well-respected individual. He was a well-rounded officer with a great deal of responsibility.
Well, as it eventually seems, he very looks to be like the patsy for this. him along with Matt Brazel as well.
Okay, continue, please.
Okay, at 4:30, Roger Ramey presents to the press an alternative story. He claims that the Army recovered a rowing target and that had been suspended from a neoprene rubber balloon. Around 5:30, Warrant Officer Irving Newton is ordered from the Weather Office at the Fort Worth Army Airfield to appear in front of a small number of 8th Air Force officers and reporters and identifies the wreckage on the floor as a balloon. Irving Newton says the weather balloon is a special kind. We use these because they go much higher than the height the eye can see. He's photographed with it and then sent back to duties. At Roswell, a sealed unmarked wooden crate is brought out and loaded into the bomb bay of the B-29, tail number 7301. 6 armed MPs guard it, never allowing it out of their sight. At Fort Worth, a number of officers meet the aircraft. One is a man the bombardier recognised as a mortician with whom he went to school. When the crate is unloaded and taken from the flight line, Jesse Marcel is driven up to the aircraft. He and the crew are told to return to Roswell. There was no briefing given to them at Fort Worth, and it's clear now that this flight was a diversion. The bodies had already been sent on to Andrews Air Force Base. Upon his return, Marcel confronts Cavett in the intelligence office. Marcel wants the reports filed in his absence, but Cavett refuses. Marcel points out that he's the senior officer, but he's told that the orders came from Washington, and if he's got a problem, to take it up with them.
Okay, Nodge. So would you say that kind of thing, that's endemic within organizations and establishments that have overruled in description, isn't it? That kind of thing is, not only just a need-to-know basis, but if you know too much, then you'll be sidetracked, you'll be sidelined to a different job or moved across.
I think you find that in any government agency, particularly stateside, where it's highly stratified, and of course one agency doesn't necessarily know what another agency is doing. What you find is a very careful guarding of particularly sensitive information, and the people who don't play ball. I mean, you see this in NASA all the time. You look proud, happy, and thrilled, otherwise you're out, sort of thing. What you tend to find is a mindset whereby everybody distrusts everybody else. There's a lot of paranoia in government agencies, particularly when information is of a sensitive nature. So none of this is surprising.
Yeah, if you want to get your carriage clock or golden watch at the end, you're not going to likely get it if you're in this kind of job, by the look of things. Steve, do you want to carry on, please?
Rock boat is very much the watchword in any government agency, really, to be honest. People are expected to not go above the pay grade, to not dissemble, to not disclose information that they've been told not to not disclose information that might not be helpful to the narrative. So there's a lot of paranoia in all these agencies, then and now. Movement
is lateral rather than forward.
It can be, yeah, or diametric. So you'll find somebody going from one grey agency to another, but without explanation. But sometimes people are forced out in the same way.
Okay, do you want to carry on, please, Steve?
Yeah, no problem. Upon his return from Fort Worth, Major Marcel describes a Hout taking pieces of the wreckage to General Ramey's office, and after returning from a map room, finding the remains of a weather balloon and radar kite substituted while he was out of the room. Marcel was obviously very upset over the situation. Hout and Marcel would not discuss this again. At 6:17, the FBI from Dallas sends a teletype to J. Edgar Hoover to tell him a balloon is responsible for the dish report and that it's on its way to Dayton for an examination. Now, this telex disputes Roger Ramey's claim that the special flight to Wright Field had been cancelled. At 7:30, the Newswire breaks the news that the Roswell source was nothing more than a balloon. Ramey announces to the world that the officers at Roswell had been fooled by a weather balloon. This is people who are at the top airbase with massive clearances, and yet they were fooled by a balloon. I mean, that is just sort of like, well, it's taking the Michael in it out of the people who work there.
Absolutely.
An unscheduled flight from Washington, D.C. arrives at Roswell, and Lewis Rickett meets the crew and gives them a box with wreckage in it they have to sign for before he'll sign it over. On Wednesday, July the 9th, 1947, all the newspaper headlines read that the flying saucer is nothing more than a weather balloon. The cleanups at the various sites continue, and at 8 a.m, members of the 1st Air Transport Unit are loading 3 or 4 C-54s with crates under guard for Los Alamos via Kirtland Air Force Base. All the crates are marked with stencils saying top secret, like some out of Indiana Jones in it. At 6 p.m, Mac Brazel calls on Frank Joyce, this time with a new story, significantly different from the one that he told him on Sunday. When Joyce points this out to Brazel, he responds that it would go hard on him if he didn't tell the new story. At 8 p.m, the flight crew is back. Again, they were not debriefed, but are told they have flown the General's furniture to Fort Worth. They are cautioned not to tell anyone, including their families, what they've done, which must be pretty strange to think that if a flown furniture for somebody, that it's a state secret. As far as everyone is concerned, the flight has not taken place. On Thursday, July the 10th, 1947, as he reads the morning newspaper, Bill Brazel learns about his father's activities in Roswell. He realises that no one will be at the ranch and makes plans to get down there.
I think it needs to be noted as well that the big aircraft, they are big aircraft, and for 4 of them, that's a lot of material. That's a lot of settees. It's a lot of sofas, a lot of sideboards, isn't it? You're dealing with a great deal of it's a lot of debris that is being moved around there.
Well, when you think of it, that the official explanation is that it's a weather balloon. I mean, as we'll find out later on as we go through this, the Project Mogul, it could have a train of balloons, which had a train of these rowing targets, which is basically tinfoil and balsa wood. Now, even if you had a trail of, say, 25 balloons with these on, and it crashed, think about it. It's a neoprene skin on the balloon, it's tinfoil on the targets, and balsa wood and tape and string. Would you need 3 or 4 C-54s to transport those?
Absolutely not, no. Carry on, Steve.
I mean, that'd be like getting, I don't know, a removals truck to take a box of comics or something like that. I mean, it sounds daft. Anyway, at the debris field and impact site, men are working to get everything cleaned up. They want nothing left and no signs of their presence. Military personnel return to Sheriff Wilcox's office and ask for the box of debris he's been storing for them. Sheriff Wilcox surrenders it without protest. Mac Brazel is being held in the guest house on the base. The office there is still trying to convince him not to say anything about what he's seen. They're also trying to keep him out of the way of the reporters. He's then given a physical by doctors at the base hospital. Sheriff Wilcox calls on Glenn Dennis's father, telling him that his son has gotten himself into trouble at the base. The sheriff had been visited by a sergeant who wants to ensure Glenn's silence. Mayor W.D. Pritchard from Alamogordo claims that a unit from his base in Roswell launched balloons around June the 14th. That, according to the article reported in the Roswell Daily Record, is undoubtedly what Brazel had found. Friday, July the 11th, 1947. The debriefings of all the participants are underway. Participants are taken into a room in small groups and told that the recovery is a highly classified event. No one is to talk about it to anyone. Everyone is to forget that it ever happened. When he tries to contact his nurse friend, Glenn Dennis is informed that she's been transferred from the base and that no one knows where she's gone.
Okay, so one of the witnesses has already been moved away surreptitiously, no access. The secrecy is really kicking into place at this point now.
It's secrecy and paranoia, I think, all rolled into one, if you ask me. Do you want me to continue?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, members of the military warn those civilians around Roswell who know something of the events that they can never talk about what happened. In some cases, the witnesses are threatened with death should they speak to anyone. On Saturday, July the 12th, 1947, Bill Brazel and his wife Shirley arrive at the ranch, but no one is around. Brazel begins his work, first surveying the ranch to see what needs to be done. He sees no evidence of a continued military presence. The trucks, jeeps, soldiers and cordon are gone. This weekend, no aircraft with gun cameras search for the flying discs, and no aircraft are on standby waiting for orders to take off. In fact, all aircraft are ordered grounded to prevent further searching. Tuesday, July the 15th, 1947, Mac Brazel returns to Roswell. All he will say about his experience is that his interrogators kept asking him the same questions over and over and over again, and that Billy's better off not knowing what happened. Besides, Mac has taken an oath that he will never reveal in detail what he saw. By now, most of the world has forgotten that a flying saucer supposedly crashed in New Mexico. Late July 1947, a deeply upset Mac Brazel tells the lineman Strickland what happened in Roswell. Though he complains bitterly about his treatment there, he honours his oath of secrecy and says nothing about what he's found. Bill Brazel finds one of the pieces of foil-like material his father described. Brazel shows this bit of debris to Sally Strickland. August 1947, Matt Brazel and ranchhand Tommy Tyree spot a piece of wreckage floating in the water at the bottom of a sinkhole. Neither man bothers to climb down to retrieve it. In September 1947, Louis S. Rickett is assigned to assist Dr. Lincoln La Paz from the University of New Mexico. Now, I don't know if anyone knows it, but Dr. La Paz was actually sent down to look at strange green lights, what was happening in the New Mexico area a couple of years earlier. La Paz's assignment is to determine, if possible, the speed and trajectory of the craft when it hit. According to Rickett, they discover a touchdown point 5 miles from the debris field where the sand has crystallized, apparently from the heat, and they find more of the foil-like material. La Paz, who apparently does not know about the bodies that were recovered, concludes that the object was an unoccupied probe from another planet. Glenn Dennis learns that his nurse friend has been killed. A letter returned as undeliverable indicates the addressee is deceased. Nurses at the Roswell base tell him she was killed in an aircraft accident while stationed in London, England. November 1947, Arthur Exon, assigned at right field, flies over the debris field and the impact site. The tracks of the trucks and jeeps are still visible, as is the gouge. Do you want to stop there, carry on?
No, I think it's interesting that the amount of work that's going into trying to keep it secret, but the amount of people that are actually involved in examining the sites, it's sort of like on a hide into nothing as far as secrecy is concerned, and in many ways not at all surprising why word did get out, why rumors did spread, that I'm sure we'll come to later.
Certainly, I've got a couple of articles somewhere regarding what we class as secrecy. Oops, 1 second. Told you I'm getting old. Just making sure I have got them notes there. Okay, in September 1948, Rickett, while in Albuquerque, meets with La Paz. La Paz remains convinced that an unoccupied probe from another planet crashed in New Mexico the year before. And you got to remember, Lincoln La Paz was a high-ranking scientist, and for him to actually come out and say that, it's obviously something of some credence. In his secret dealings with various government projects, La Paz has found nothing to cause him to change his mind. October 1948, Rickett meets with John Worth, another CIC agent. Rickett asks Worth about the status of the material recovered at Roswell, and is told they had yet to figure it out. According to Worth, they hadn't been able to cut it. Summer 1950, from time to time in the 2 years following the crash, Bill Brazel had found scraps of the craft. His father confirms as saying, "That looks like some of the contraption I found." Bill Brazel in Corona mentions his discoveries. The next day, Captain Armstrong and 3 others from the Roswell base arrive and ask for the material. Armstrong reminds Brazel that his dad cooperated with him, and it's the younger Brazel's patriotic duty to give it up. Brazel can't think of a good reason to deny it to them and surrenders it. Boyd Wetflower discusses the crash of an alien spacecraft with Dr. Lincoln La Paz.
I think it's worth noting here the amount of fervor and patriotic pride that was prevalent in the United States at that time would have dictated that there would have been an almost cultish type of, or rather, there would have been a massive amount of peer pressure for people to keep a secret once told. Loose lips sink ships kind of attitude, massively prevalent across the US society. I don't know what your thoughts are, Nodge.
Well, there's an old saying in history and historiography, Dave. History is written by the winners, and I think what you're seeing there is the new age of empire that came on the United States in the immediate years after the Second World War. You heard phrases like the world policeman, and that's very much this is very much what you're seeing here. A large number of operatives involved, a lot of secrecy, witnesses being basically signing affidavits and being told to mind their P's and Q's. So, yeah, very much indeed.
Continue, please, Steve.
Of course, you've got to remember, though, like I said before, it's the time of the Reds under the beds. So if you weren't doing that little bit of the good bit for the United States of America, you obviously were a communist. And if that was the case, that was it. Game over for you. You either get ostracized by your community or you get chucked into prison. So everybody had to do the bit. It was another case of living in fear. That Nodge said, the victor rewrites history, and that's what was happening at the time. History was being rewritten. It was a case of like, if you want to be part of the American history, then prove you're not a communist.
Just one other thing to say here, guys, and it's to do with the nature of historical and official evidence and the way that it's treated. I'm sure you'll be coming on to this later yourself, Steve, so I won't steal your thunder, but there's a high degree of what historians call revisionism in terms of the Roswell story. Now, what you're doing is you're debunking some of that by giving us a great timeline in terms of what actually happened and some of the things around it. But as we'll see later on, in terms of the stuff that comes out of the woodwork in the 70s, what I find interesting is the amount of revisionism that went on after this period.
Okay, carry on, Steve, please.
Okie dokes. In 1952, Major Ellis Bouldrer, an engineer stationed at Roswell, discovered samples of the debris locked in a safe in the engineering office at Roswell Air Force Base. In the course of his experiments, he tries to burn and melt it with an acetylene torch and to cut it with a large variety of tools. Although extremely thin, the metal resists his efforts, and when crumpled, it quickly returns to its original shape. I did get a quick thing on the comment section in regards of an article that was in the Omni magazine sometime in the late 80s, early 90s about nitinol, which was a memory metal. It's used very similar now into glasses frames. But one time they were actually using it for use with bike wheels, with all the spokes in it. Literally, you could batter it with a sledgehammer and it revert back to its state. I will have a look, because I have got the article somewhere. If I can find it, I'll pass it over to Dave and he can post it on a forum, whatever, for you to see. In 1969, as Americans walk on the moon, Melvin F. Brown tells his family he's seen the wreckage of an extraterrestrial craft and the bodies of the crew. He assisted in the recovery, taking the bodies into Roswell. In 1972, Inez Wilcox tells her granddaughter Barbara Duggar of the involvement of the Chavez County Sheriff in the events of 1947. She says her husband, Sheriff Wilcox, was informed that one of the beings survived the crash. Mrs. Wilcox says military personnel used death threats to keep the family from talking about the events. 1978, Pappy Henderson confides in his close friend John Cromschroeder that he flew wreckage from a crash source out of Roswell and to Dayton, Ohio. He shows Cromschroeder a fragment of the debris and tells his friend that he saw alien bodies. Jesse Marcel is interviewed by a number of researchers, including Leonard H. Stringfield, who was an absolutely amazing researcher, and Stanton T. Friedman. He was the same, brilliant. And Marcel tells them that he's sure that the wreckage is nothing from Earth. Later, Marcel grants interviews to various news organisations, but those reports don't gain wide dissemination. In 1980, syndicated television programme In Search Of, which used to have Leonard Nimoy, good old Mr. Spock, narrating it, as an episode about UFO cover-ups and interviews Marcel. In the course of that interview, Marcel again insists the material he saw had no earthly origin. Charles Berlitz and William L. Moore, who had previously done books about Atlantis and the Bermuda Triangle, published the Roswell Incident, the first attempt at a comprehensive analysis of the events at Roswell. In the course of his research, William Moore located and interviewed more than 70 witnesses who had some knowledge of the events. And in 1982, after reading the story about the events at Roswell in a tabloid newspaper, Pappy Henderson tells his wife Sappho that everything in the story was true. He knows from his own personal involvement, and he's surprised that the story is being released, and moreover, that it's accurately reported. He says even the descriptions of the bodies are accurate. These are some of the key personnel that was involved. That's Jesse Marcel there with some of the switch debris. That's only ordinary tinfoil there. That's the public information officer of the 509 Bomb Group. That's Walter Holt. Phil Corso, who brought a book out himself later on called The Day After Roswell, which I had to put that in because it always reminds me of the duck out of Tom and Jerry. And I know I shouldn't say that, but I just find it funny every time I see him. That's Tom. Oh, just go back. Sorry, that's Thomas DeBose and Nathan Twining, two of the massive officers who obviously that was when the cover-up started. Roger Raymer, he was probably the instigator of all of it. That's Butch Blanchard, who was in charge of the base at the time. Good old Sheriff Wilcox there, answering the telephone, who was apparently a straightforward guy. And this is Glenn Dennis's sketch of what his nurse friend left on the napkin, which is obviously the heads of the alien and a description of the hands. Right.
So to remind the audience, Glenn Dennis is the mortician.
Yes, Glenn Dennis is, but we'll be coming more to Glenn Dennis later on for reasons that will no doubt be coming out in a few minutes' time.
Well, okay, so that's pretty much a rundown of what went on from obviously the nights that the crash occurred, or the nights that the crash allegedly occurred, up until pretty much the present day, or at least up until 1982. However, it's more in depth than that as well, isn't it? I mean, there's lots of theories, there's lots of conjecture over what the bodies look like, the descriptions of the extraterrestrial biological entities, the shape of the saucer, the materials found, the sheer amount of witnesses, because the amount of witnesses is massively widespread. There were many witnesses, dozens in fact.
50, but like I said, to try and cover all of it in one show would be pretty near impossible. So I've gone for what I would class as the main ones. And even when I come to the bit shortly in the section about silencing the witnesses, even that's been narrowed down to just a few, because time constraints, it's as simple as that. And like you say, everything else that comes in, what were the bodies like? What was the actual shape of the space? If you went through everything, you would be literally looking at a plethora of so many different things. It's unbelievable.
Of course, now a lot of what the public know about Roswell is because of the media portrayals, TV shows, documentaries, and so on. But there was obviously stories going about because there were a lot of witnesses. There were people that were privy to this information. They had seen things. The nurse, the mortician, so some of the military key figures that had also seen the alien bodies at the hospital, and the red-headed officer at the hospital that was making sure everybody kept their mouth shut. I mean, this is a big point of it, is silencing the witnesses here, and one that I'm sure everybody will find really interesting. As it says there, it's just a small minority, the main witnesses, because there were so many. Well,
the red-haired guy apparently cropped up in many different instances. The only problem, again, what I have with that, and as you'll see as we go along, is that there is inconsistencies within that, which was one of the main testimonies of one of the witnesses, which has fell through. So if the other witnesses have mentioned about this red-haired guy, can we take that as read? And that's the whole problem in regards of the Roswell witness testimony, that there's little bits here and there which are taken from so many things, and some things have fell apart. So can you believe all of it? Now, whether that's the fact that it's, memory from years gone by, or it's disinformation, I don't know. I mean, personally, I do think something happened, but as to what, I don't know. And as to the witness testimony, I don't know, because I think so much of it has been so convoluted and twisted round over the years, and so many people have jumped on the bandwagon, it's difficult to find.
Do you think it's like the part of the human condition, Nodge, for when something this big, especially in a community like Roswell, to want to be part of the story, to want to be included, whether it's for fame or infamy, but just to be part of the history of the area, need to want to be involved, and at the risk of lying and being exposed? Do you think it's part of the human condition, and especially within the melting pot of the USA during the late 1940s?
Well, there were two very clever anthropologists working in the States in the 70s and 80s, Dave, who I've written this up and committed this to memory, because yes, I do, and I think the psychology of it is when a story goes public, there has to be an appetite for it. It has to fit in with people's idea of what fits in terms of the historical period. So we were talking before about historical revisionism. I mean, this is one reason that statues of slave traders are being chucked into rivers at the moment. People are reevaluating the past, and this is very much the story with Roswell. I think you're absolutely right. And what Harding and Stewart observed was that the Roswell story was a prime example of how a disclosure moved from the fringes to the mainstream, in the intervening period between the 40s and the 70s. And to quote them, it tied in well with the public preoccupation, the growing preoccupation in the 1980s with conspiracy, cover-up, and repression.
Okay, so obviously now we're at the stage where we have to discuss the need for the powers that be to try and squash any kind of information getting out for lots of different reasons, sociological implications, theological implications, and obviously the need for control. So if we run this, Steve, and go through some of the witnesses that were silenced, if you'd be so kind.
Well, what I'll do is I'll go through this because this is obviously some of the major witnesses will describe what had happened to them. But like you say, at the end of it, we'll perhaps have a little discussion of why this is the case, because although the witnesses were silenced, they weren't told why. Like you say, they were told that they had to be patriotic, but we can discuss amongst ourselves why we think it was done, if that's okay. Okay. So silencing the witnesses. Mac Brazel. Now, Mac Brazel, like I say, he seems to be the obviously the person who seems to have brought everything to light. He was seen on July the 9th under escort from 3 military officers, where he was taken to the offices of the Roswell Daily Record. Later in the day, he calls Frank Joyce, the reporter, as we've said this before, and he announced on the Roswell radio station KGFL and tells him a different story to the one that he told the report previously. And when Joyce pointed this out, Brazel said if he didn't tell this story the way he was told to, this would go hard on him. So it's at this point that allegedly made this statement to Joyce. When folks talk about little green men, well, they ain't green. Now, was that a little thing that he just threw in? I don't know. There's a couple. It's an ambiguous statement. Some other people say that he actually said something else, but that is the popular statement that was given back. Now, on July the 10th, Brazel was being held on the Air Force Base, where officers were repeatedly trying to convince him not to tell people what he had seen. By keeping him on the base, it also kept him away from reporters, and he was also given a medical while he was there, because apparently they believed that at the time that what they had found was possibly radioactive, and that's why they were giving him a medical. It turned out there was no radioactive thing on site. Anyway, on July the 15th, Brazel returned home, tells the family they're better off not knowing what had gone on. Now, just a little side from that, there's also reports intimating that he turned up in Roswell driving a brand new truck. Now, you could look at this and say that at the time, if anyone was to come up with proof that there was a flying saucer that had been found, they were going to get $3,000. That was the sort of bounty on the head of a flying saucer. So you've got to look at it this way. If they gave him $3,000 and he bought this truck from it, that's like an admittance that he'd found a flying saucer. Or was the $3,000 or whatever money was given to him to buy a truck, was that some form of hush money?
Yeah, it's also it's big signals from the government too, or the powers that be, that you Mister, keep quiet, keep everything stum, and we'll look after you. So it's signalling from both sides, and it's signalling from Mac Brazel, it's signalling from the government. And it doesn't look totally good, does it? The fact that he's driving around in a new truck, if that indeed is true, because I believe it is true, isn't it? He was driving around in a new truck.
The thing is, I mean, afterwards he did stick to, if they did sort of pay him off, he did stick to it. He didn't sort of come out and say, well, yeah, I've got $3,000 for this, but I'm going to tell you I found a crash flying saucer and this, that, and the other. He didn't mention it again, even to his family. He was like, I'm telling you now, you really don't want to know. So he kept it quiet. But like we were saying before, that people in that time, they were people of the word, that, they believed that what they were doing was patriotic. So if they had to uphold an oath, they would do.
Okay, can we move on to the next witness?
Yep. So you'd make you sound like off Judge Judy there. Right, the next one is Sheriff George Wilcox. Now, George Wilcox, he was threatened also not to talk. His daughter, Barbara Duggar, told investigators that the military police that turned up at the jailhouse and had told him that if he spoke about the incident, he would be killed. And also his family would be as well, which I thought was a little unfair on George, for the simple reason. At one point, they actually entrusted him to hold a box of debris. And when he turned up, well, I should say, when the military turned back and said, can we have the box back? He just handed it over. No arguments, no nothing. And yet they came at him and said, mention this, we'll kill you and we'll kill your family. I think that's a bit naughty, but that's just me.
Yeah, but that definitely also is a massive signals, isn't it? I mean, far from quashing it, it's just creating and breeding an atmosphere of mistrust and paranoia and fear.
It certainly is. I mean, come on, at the end, right, I don't want to go too far into it, but the way I see it, right, they're going on and banging on that this is a super secret weather balloon. And yet, they've gone and photographed Jesse Marcel with this super secret weather balloon, which they put across all the news wires. So it can't be that super secret if they're willing to put it out over the news wires. So if that's the case, why do you have to threaten people with death with it?
Yeah, control. All about control. I mean, I'm sure Nodge will know, be able to put his 2 cents worth in that way regards control and the need for the powers that be to have control.
I don't think we should ever be in any doubt that governments and government agencies, and particularly those in charge of them, will use fear as a very real and potent weapon against anybody who is in danger of betraying something, especially when they're not actually directly in their hierarchy. So in other words, you can't be threatened with losing your job, but be careful the next time you drive down a lonely road.
Well, can we have the next witness, please?
Yes, Judge David. Next witness is Dan Dyer and Frankie Rowe. Now, Frankie Rowe's father, who you can see on the right-hand side, was Dan Dyer. If you look at the photograph on the left, he's the rather paunchy person on the far left-hand side. He was a firefighter in Roswell in 1947. When Sheriff Wilcox sent out the details to the fire service in regards of the first crash, which was near the ranch, Dan Dyer was one of the respondents to answer the call on the morning of July the 5th, 1947. Frankie's father recovered some of the wreckage and took it back to the fire station, where later in the day she went to have a look at the strange debris. The father told her at the crash site he witnessed 2 bodies that were in body bags and saw another that was alive who was about the size of a 10-year-old child. A few days later, armed military police shown up at her house. The MPs threatened the parents. This again was supposed to be the red-haired guy who was with a, like, I think is it like a nightstick or something that he was banging in his hand and banging on the table to, every time he finished a sentence he would slap it into his hands as though to emphasise a point. They shown up at the house, and the MPs threatened the parents, also her as well, who was only a kid at the time. Now, her dad was obviously annoyed at the ways the MPs were intimidating not only himself and his wife, but the kids as well. They were warned never to talk to anyone about what had happened or what they'd seen. And if they did, they would be taken out into the desert where no one would find them again.
Typical scare tactics, typical repression of information, typical subjugation of truth and factuality within a community to, suit a narrative.
Definitely, but do you not think it very despicable the way they treated children as well? But, like you say, in times of need, I suppose, if people need pushing one way or another, I think that's the way that they would go forward, isn't it? If, threaten the kids, it keeps the parents quiet.
That's the thing, isn't it? It's leverage. I think any time that anybody under any circumstance and for any reason threatens a parent by using the kids as a weapon is absolutely despicable. It's inexcusable. There is no reason to do it, and it's definitely the lowest of the low. And to think that anybody in society would do it, let alone governmental bodies that are allegedly supposed to have the welfare of the common people, or the welfare of their populace. And we all know that that's not true. But to be able to try to tamper down that kind of thing, to try to box people in, to try and make these kind of threats just to get the end result is absolutely despicable beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Definitely. I mean, it's like the old adage, isn't it? People should not be afraid of the government should be afraid of the people. It's as simple as that.
Absolutely correct. Okay,
next one is Joseph, that should be Montoya, sorry about that, that's my mistake at the top. Joseph Montoya and Ruben Anaya. Now, Ruben Anaya was a cook at the Roswell Air Force Officers Club and was close friends with New Mexico's Lieutenant Governor Joseph Montoya. During the events that were transpiring around Roswell, Anaya got a call whilst at work from Montoya telling him to pick him up from the base and to get him the hell out of there. When Anaya arrived to the point where Montoya had told him to pick him up from, he saw that the place was a massive activity. Montoya then jumped into the car, pale and agitated, and told Anaya just to get him away from there quickly. He then started to tell Anaya that there had been a crash of a strange disc-like craft and the military had rounded up the debris, but not just wreckage, dead creatures that not only had been seen, but he had also witnessed a live, small, skinny one being accompanied into the area where he was. Anaya took Montoya home, and a few days later, Montoya told Anaya to keep his mouth shut about what he'd been told, as it was too dangerous, and that the FBI would do away with them both.
Okay, so we the report, or rather the news coming through of a live EBE. There's been a live, not just dead bodies, not just recovered corpses from the crash site, but a live alien found, a live alien seen.
That's most definitely it. And when you think of it, this guy was like, he was quite high up in the area. He was lieutenant governor. I mean, that's pretty high up, that in that neck of the woods.
Do you think that was not just the fact that material was recovered, not just the fact that that it was needed to be a secret, but the fact that there was proof, not just materialistic, but biological proof that there was life from other planets, that because of that, the very fact that they had technology which obviously outweighed the American government, world governments which were in control, if you like, the actual living proof that they weren't in control, they didn't have all the power, was the reason that they did go to such lengths to try and cover it up, to threaten people to the extent of saying they would kill the children and despicable things like that.
Well, I think that just goes to show the extent of just how scared that the government were running at that point, that if they had to stoop to that level, they were running scared.
Nodge, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, it's a big thing for a living creature, an alien being to be seen, for any world government to have a biological proof of life outside of the Earth.
It is, and to be honest, we talk about governments fearing people and people fearing the governments. In my experience, the one thing that governments fear is the unknown and things that they can't control, particularly when they're an example of a power or of an influence that goes well beyond their own. So yeah, I mean, it's a big deal, isn't it, to be honest? And that sort of intelligence and knowledge and evidence is definitely worth a government killing for. It's definitely worth a government suppressing the truth for, and it's definitely worth a government trying to splash disinformation about, which I think there was a lot of disinformation about Roswell that was deliberately perpetuated by government agencies to try and fudge the story over.
Now, they aren't the only witnesses, though, are they, Steve? There is more.
Oh, yeah. Well, like I said, there is loads of witnesses, but I've picked ones which are salient. And unfortunately, this is where the fun begins. So do you want me to continue?
Absolutely.
Okay. Walt Whitmore and Judd Roberts. So tell a lie. It doesn't begin. It begins on the next one. Now, Walt Whitmore, and he was the owner of Roswell radio station KGFL, and Judd Roberts, there on the right, who was part owner, were warned that if they didn't leave the crash story alone, they would have 24 hours to find something else to do, as they would no longer be in the radio business. So basically, someone came on and said, look, it's nice what you normally do, but we don't like the fact that you're putting out this story about a flying saucer. Either you keep it quiet or you lose your license.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, this is where the fun begins. This is Glenn Dennis. Right. Please
who, of course, is the mortician. This is the mortician we're talking about now, by the way.
He is. And, I don't know what it is, but for many years I've always said, I don't trust anybody who wears one of these things around the neck. I don't know what it is, but let's just go from there. Anyway, Glenn Dennis made his first claim of alien bodies for Roswell crash on August 5th, 1989, in an interview with Stanton Friedman, and was first made public in mid-1991 in the Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt book, UFO Crash at Roswell. He initially answered at the funeral home in July 1947, a phone call from the Roswell Army Air Force Base, and they asked him if he had any small caskets. Dennis asked if there had been an accident, to which the other person just asked if they had any 3'6" or 4 foot hermetically sealed baby caskets. Dennis said he had one, and then the man said, how long would it take you to get more? And then hung up. A short while after, the man called again, asking Dennis what type of chemicals were contained in embalming fluid, and if he had any advice on how to store a body without changing its chemical composition. Dennis said that he asked again what was going on. The man said that they were having a meeting of what to do if they had an epidemic and what resources were available to them. Now, later that day, Dennis then transported an injured airman to Roswell Air Force Hospital and noticed lots of field ambulances outside. And one of these ambulances had the doors open slightly at the back, and he saw what he believed was a shiny stainless steel with pink and purple and black shading. After passing the airman over, he went to get his voucher stamp so that he could get paid and noticed the hospital was a lot busier than usual. He nipped into the nurse's lounge to get a coat, where he was met by a captain leaning against the door. He said, "It looks like you got a crash. Do you need to get help with it?" And then this old boy got mad, he said. He wanted to know who the hell I was, and he said, "Don't take a step." And then he ordered 2 MPs to escort me off the base.
Is this the ginger officer?
Yeah, another ginger officer. It's the same one that seems to be part of the relative. I was going to mention that, but yeah, that's the one. One drove the ambulance, the other one followed in a truck. When they were taking me out, I saw a nurse, and she had a thing on her face like a mask, and she just said to me, "Get the hell out of here." The next day, the nurse he had encountered a friend of his, met him in a coffee shop and told him about the strange creatures. Now, Glenn Dennis said it was a coffee shop at one point, but in another thing, he said that he was actually at the officers' club at Roswell. She told him about the strange creatures that had been brought to the hospital. The nurse was upset and crying. She drew what the creatures looked like on a napkin, small creatures with large heads and eyes and 4 fingers with suction cups on the ends. Dennis took the drawings and put them in a file folder in a cabinet at the funeral home, a cabinet that later was taken to the dump. Surprise. "I didn't talk about this until 1990, he said. "I just didn't want to get involved in it. I never told my wife or anybody else. If I told this in 1947, who would have believed it anyway? I didn't want my kids getting made fun of because of the old man seeing flying things." Now, according to Dennis, a nurse friend from the Roswell Army Air Force Base Hospital told him that she had participated in the autopsy of 3 strange alien creatures, and she gave him sketches of the creatures after getting a sacred oath for him to keep it secret. Immediately afterwards, according to Dennis, the nurse friend was transferred to England, and his letter to her returned deceased. He claimed he had heard later that she had been killed in a military plane crash. Unfortunately, no records of any such plane crash exist in either the New York Times Index, National Transportation Safety Board, or Army Air Force records. And in another interview, Dennis said he had never tried to contact her after she'd left the base. And from the MUFON UFO Journal, April 1992, Dennis said, "I never did try to contact her. She did join an order to become a nun after she got out of the army." Roswell researchers finally got Dennis to name his nurse friend as Naomi Maria Self. The morning report that lists all military personnel still exists for the Roswell Army Air Force Field for July 1947. They showed there were only 5 nurses assigned to Roswell Army Airfield during July 1947, and none of these were suddenly transferred to England or anywhere overseas. None of the nurses were named as Naomi Maria Self or had any name resembling that name. Thorough searches of the files in the National Personnel Records Centre failed to find anyone by that name that had ever served in the military. One nurse was transferred on September the 4th, 1947 because of a medical condition and admitted to the hospital at another base in Texas. Another nurse was transferred to the Fort Worth Army Airfield on July the 23rd, 1947, not early July as claimed by Dennis. Dennis later claimed that the nurse's name wasn't Self, but wouldn't tell anybody what a new name was supposed to be. None of the nurses that were at the base in July 1947 seemed to fit what Dennis claims. Carl Flock, who at the time was a believer in the Roswell incident, in a January 6, 1995 letter wrote to Dennis the following: "An Air Force investigator and a private investigator have located hospital morning reports and other hospital records for the entirety of 1947, showing who was on duty and when, etc. They've also identified all the nurses who were assigned to the base during that year and when they were assigned there and transferred out." And Carl Flock was forced to the conclusion that Dennis's nurse friend simply didn't exist. Randall, who had used Dennis's tale in his books, has now abandoned Dennis as a credible witness. Who do you think is the least credible witness of the Roswell witnesses, and why? To which Randall replied, Jim Ragsdale for changing his story, Gerald Anderson for inventing his and getting caught in his lies, and Glenn Dennis for changing the name of the nurse that once we proved that she didn't exist.
Okay, so now we're moving on to probably one of a very, very important witness now, and the last one for this list, I believe.
Well, this one we will carry over, but this is Frank Kaufman. And while we're talking about pork pies, we're going to talk about Frank Kaufman shortly. This will cross over into another part of it.
Okay, so that's a rundown of the main witnesses, or at least some of the more salient witnesses that are involved in the case of the Roswell thing. Now, after all that, of course, there's not been a lot come out, as it did go quiet for many, many years. No speaking of it, everything had been absolutely squashed. Either you got Matt Brazel has been paid off, you've got people's lives have been threatened, the livelihoods have been threatened, radio stations being taken off the air if they disclose any kind of information, mismatches of so-called relevant information, reports that don't pan out, nurses that all of a sudden go to a different job and then all of a sudden they become a nun, nurses that don't exist or change name. So a lot of misinformation and a lot of squashing of information and then silence.
Indeed, it was literally as though Roswell had fell off the face of the earth. I mean, I've been quite lucky over the years because, as Nodge will testify, that I've been quite lucky from a very young age to pick up books over the years, stuff that people would never have even bothered reading about because it wasn't mainstream stuff. And I managed to get some books by Frank Edwards, who was a journalist in the United States who wrote many an article and a good few books, and also had a radio show in regards of UFOs and associated phenomena. And in one of the books that he came out with was statements about the Roswell crash, basically about something happening in New Mexico, but it didn't really extrapolate on it. And it always sort of lodged in the back of my mind that about, like, oh, where's this come from? But, that's by the by. So anyway, what we'll do, as you can see on the screen, we've got nothing for decades.
Okay, so, if I could just jump in one sec, yeah, Steve. Right, I'd like to bring Nodge in for a sec here, yeah. Because given everything that we've just been speaking about there, Nodge, given the fact that everything had gone quiet, is that down to the fact that the techniques used by the government, the techniques used by the American Air Force had worked? The suppression of information, the threats, all that lot had worked, and was it because there wasn't anything behind it? Do you think the newspaper article, the retraction of the original newspaper article, had been done enough to damage the story within the rest of the USA, despite what was known within the small community of Roswell itself?
I suspect the answer, Dave, is we don't know. Because if something is successful, if there's been successful suppression of known facts, which is obviously when 50 years later you get real historical shocks in retrospect, we honestly don't know. I mean, it's very unusual for something to go radio silent if there's truth to something. So the answer is we don't know. It could possibly be that everything had been sort of buttoned down, in terms of loose cannons and everything, that everything had been tied down. People had been told not to say anything. It must also be said, and Steve would be the first to say this and actually mentioned it in his excellent timeline and profile of the principal personalities, that there were some untruths in there. So in terms of Glenn Dennis, the ufologists involved, people like Randall and Carl Flock, actually said that Dennis was very, very uncredible as a witness. He changed the names of one of the nurses, and once they'd proved that she didn't exist and that sort of thing. Dennis's accounts in particular were doubted by researcher Carl Flock, and Brian Dunning, who's written a sort of good skeptical analysis of what went on at Roswell, basically noted that Dennis could never have been regarded as a reliable witness, considering that he'd waited for 40 years before he started to recount a narrative that was, very disconnected and highly irrational in terms of the fact that it didn't join the dots. So I think the government may have used that to their advantage in the interceding 30 years. And obviously, once people like Friedman, who was an excellent guy. I mean, this guy was a top-notch researcher and scientist, started to come to the surface. But we see this in everyday life, don't we? We see that governments manage to hush up terrible, terrible things, and then 30, 40 years they come to the fore, and public interest is all the greater because of it.
And this, of course, gives us the nothing for decades. Steve, if you'd like to continue with that, that'd be great.
Yeah, most certainly. Okay, of course, the job of silencing the witnesses had paid off, because it wasn't until 1978, when Stanton Friedman interviewed Jesse Marcel, that things were brought out of the shadows. From 1978 to the early 90s, hundreds of people who claimed to have either been involved or witnessed the events of Roswell were interviewed by the likes of Stanton Friedman, William Moore, Kevin D. Randall, Don Schmidt and Carl Flock, just to name a few. From these accounts and what was gleaned from the many hundreds of Freedom of Information requests, documents that came to the conclusion that at least one, possibly more, alien spacecraft with alien occupants had crashed in the New Mexico desert near New Mexico, near Roswell, and consequently been recovered by the military and the events covered up. Now, some of the main books that came out in regards of the Roswell incident are as follows. The Roswell Incident. This was written by Bill Moore and Charles Bullets after previously written books on the Bermuda Triangle and the Philadelphia experiment. Although uncredited, Stanton Friedman had done a large amount of research for this book. Over 90 witnesses were interviewed, including Jesse Marcel, Matt Brazel's son Brill, Brazel's neighbour Floyd Proctor, and radio station owner Walt Whitman. I may say, as a personal thing for myself, that it was also nice to see inside it there was a picture of Huey Green from Opportunity Knox in his Canadian Air Force gear, because he said that he actually remembers hearing the thing being sent out over the radio news. That's just me chucking a bit of rubbish in there, so I apologise for that.
Brilliant.
There were descriptions of the lightweight but strong metal, photos of Marcel with the switch weather balloon debris, and accounts of witness intimidation. The story of civil engineer Barney Barrett and some archaeology students seeing bodies and wreckage popped up for the first time. The book's conclusion was that an alien craft was flying over the New Mexico desert, observing US nuclear weapons activity, but crashed after being hit by lightning, killing the aliens on board, and a government cover-up duly followed.
Okay, fantastic.
Do you want me to carry on?
Yes, absolutely. You keep going.
Okay. Hang on. Next one, sorry. Come back. Well, I've actually made a cock up here of the... There we go. I'll go back to that one. UFO crash at Roswell in 1991. In 1991, Kevin Randall and Donald Schmidt published UFO Crash at Roswell, which was such a bestseller, they based the 1994 TV movie Roswell on it. This book added 100 new witnesses, altered and tightened the narrative, and included new events such as a cordon with military police, a recovery operation, a huge gouge in the ground at the crash site, and Brazel leading the army to a second crash site where they came across the previously mentioned Barney Barrett and the archaeology students. Witness Glenn Dennis was introduced after he had phoned the hotline for the TV show Unexplained Mysteries, and the accounts of alien autopsies and corpses at Roswell Air Force Base was presented.
Yeah, a massively big selling book regarding the Roswell incident, beyond a shadow of a doubt.
And unfortunately, I say I got me bits all screwed up. But before that actually happened, Unsolved Mysteries aired the case as part of the September the 20th, 1989 episode. The update was then aired as part of the September 18th, 1994 episode. And this is what Glenn Dennis had seen, and then decided to phone in to say that he was actually part and parcel of all this at Roswell.
Okay.
So if we go back, the next one would be Crash at Corona by my old mucker, Stanton C. Friedman. And I say that because, without blowing my own trumpet, we did used to actually send letters to each other before the days of email. And he was one of the nicest blokes I've ever met within the field of ufology, and he always had time to speak to anybody, not just people who were sort of well known within the ufological circles, but people who had a genuine interest into stuff.
And Steve,
I think it's worth.
You very kindly showed me some letters that Mr. Freeman sent to you as well.
Yeah, he's such a nice bloke, really was, and sadly missed.
I think it's worth noting, of course, that this is not just a ufologist and an author. He was a nuclear physicist. He was a very well-educated and well-respected man.
He certainly was, even though some of the numpties in the ufological circles of the 90s who thought they were very clever. Used to call him an unclear physicist, not a nuclear, but an unclear physicist. But these were the same idiots who used to sort of sit round and sort of chuck stones at everybody else who was bothering to actually do research into ufology. So you don't take them.
Okay.
Yeah.
And of course, this isn't just the only publication. There were lots of things starting to come out of this after the publications of these books. Lots of information being portrayed in the media, documentaries. So the wall of silence, or the lack of information, was starting to crumble. People were starting to learn more about it. Information was coming out, and the public eye was being awoken too. I mean, this was a massive case. Lots of people had heard about flying saucers. There were books all over the place. People had been watching TV. They'd been watching films. There were lots and lots of films. There were lots and lots of portrayals of alien beings and lots of portrayals of saucers. But this one in particular was most certainly the biggest one, beyond a shadow of a doubt. This is the one that sort of made or break the story in the eyes of the public. And I think, even you yourself, Nodge, you'll agree that as sightings go, as UFO cases go, this is an epoch moment. Was the revelation coming out in the late 70s, in the early 80s, of a crash at Roswell.
It is interesting, Dave, but I've got to say, as somebody, I will not use the word skeptic, because I always follow Steve's advice and I keep an open mind. But to me, what fascinates me about Roswell, and you're absolutely right, it is an epoch-making case because of the impact that it had on the public psyche, not just in America but across the globe. But to me, what fascinates me about this is it obviously came to light in the late 70s, early 80s, a very time when, first of all, the American public were beginning to truly distrust very deeply the government and the government agencies. And also, it's paved the way for the way that ufology has gone. And again, Steve knows far more about these things than me. But there is a thing, I don't know if you've come across it, that skeptics and skeptical analysts call Roswellian syndrome. In other words, every sort of ufology case that's followed it goes through what they claim to be 5 distinct stages of development: incident, debunking, submergence, mythologizing, and then the re-emergence and media bandwagon effect. So in other words, it's not just important because of the case itself, but it's important because of the effects it had on the public, on officialdom, but also on the people involved in research.
The thing is in many cases, not just in ufology, obviously in the paranormal as well, in general, is the fact that the ability to debunk, the ability to be skeptic, seems to be only the luxury allowed by skeptics, not people that might have might be more readily of a standpoint to believe. Whether it's the paranormal, like I said, ufology. I do find for the most part that many people there's a bigger leaning towards people willing to believe in spirituality and in the paranormal, in apparitions, rather than in ufology. It's like in a way that ufology, the possibility of life from other planets, of alien beings, is been poo-pooed so massively in the media and portrayed so dramatically by Hollywood and other places that it's almost looked at as being a joke.
I think you're right. I mean, to an extent, a lot of this is to do with public perception. And the one thing that I would respectfully suggest is that there's a difference between verifiable UFO incidents and the possibility of life on other planets. There are 250 billion stars in the galaxy, and there are probably, we think, 200 to 300 billion galaxies beyond, and that's current estimates. And every time we get a new telescope, it goes up tenfold. Frank Drake estimated from his equation that there were 100,000 possible alien civilizations in the galaxy. So by that law of statistics, you can see that actually alien visitation shouldn't just be a commonplace thing, but it should be a readily believable thing in purely statistical and scientific terms. I think I wouldn't deign to tell you about about the paranormal and ufology compared. But I agree with you. I think there's a difference, if you like, between the way that things are perceived, and I think a lot of that has to do with the media bandwagon effect that some of the skeptics have actually perpetuated. I think in terms of what you're doing, the paranormal, people are prepared perhaps more to believe that because everybody has a personal connection with the paranormal, with people they've lost, with incidents that perhaps they've either witnessed or been told about by family members. Whereas UFOs are sometimes a more remote thing in regards to the fact that, one, the state is heavily involved, two, the military is usually involved because of security issues and because they're often called in to take expert testimony from witnesses, very often who are trained pilots or people like Friedman who are nuclear physicists and so on. So I think you're right that it's been poo-pooed, but let's not forget that, I think common and popular culture has got a lot to do with it. UFOs have been lambasted and ridiculed because of popular films and science fiction that have not done us any favors in the way that cases and incidents are portrayed. I don't know what Steve would think of that.
Did you get any of that, lads? I appear to have been cut off by a network connection, so I don't know what you got and what you didn't.
No, we'll just carry on from where we've gone. I'll get back to you from a point to carry on from in a minute, Steve.
Yeah, no problem.
The fact of the matter is, they sort of said that the rough estimate, using the technology that they've got now to look out into the universe, to look out beyond our solar system, is that the amount of planets that are capable of holding life, because there's just a few remits, that's all that's necessary for a planet to hold life. But for the rough estimate of planets that could hold life is 50 sextillion. Now that's 5 with something like 21 zeros behind it. That is a massive amount of planets.
Yeah, absolutely. The known number of star systems in the universe is, at a conservative estimate, estimated to be 1 to the power of 24, which is a septillion. So in terms of viable star systems, we know that NASA have now identified over 4,000 exoplanets around nearby stars in the galaxy, but it must be said that they need either optical or radio signal quality that is good enough to detect the orbital wobble of stars that allow them to see whether or not there are large planets in orbit of the planets. And an Earth-like planet wouldn't always show in terms of orbital wobble. Planets and stars orbit each other's common center of gravity in physical terms, so the planet needs to have a substantial enough mass to push the axis of the star slightly off center. So it's undoubtedly the bigger number rather than the smaller number, because the universe grew by a factor of 10 about 20 years ago after the Hubble looked at a patch of sky that everybody thought was just a small patch of empty and contained 5 to 6 trillion stars or something. So
absolutely,
yeah, there you go.
Okay, so we sort of started to come towards midway or maybe to the end of the Nothing for Decades section there, Steve. There was the Stanton Friedman book, and then I think we pretty much got a drop out from there on.
Okay, let me get back to it. So we get the truth about is that about fair to say where we're up to? Let me just put the screen save on it. Screen share.
That's where we're up to, yes.
So does that look about right for you?
Okay, bringing it back in. Just before that, but I think this is a good point as I need to move on from, yeah.
Okay, just give me 1 second while I find my notes back again. It's well and truly screwed me over with this dropping the internet connection, so I apologise. Okay.
Now Frank Kaufman's been on many documentaries that I'm sure a lot of people have seen. He's a well-known face. Yeah,
unfortunately. Anyway, the truth about the Roswell UFO crash from 1994. Like a tennis game, Randall and Schmidt responded with another book, this time including the claim that alien bodies were taken by cargo plane to be viewed by Dwight D. Eisenhower, who wanted to see the aliens. A lot of the new material hung on the testimony of a new alleged witness called Frank Kaufman, also known as Steve McKenzie. The book is considered by many to be the definitive version of the Roswell crash, but for quite a long time his credibility has been under attack as parts of his story failed to check out. Kevin Randall had been one of the researchers defending Frank, even going as far as to say and admitting that while parts of Frank's story may have been fabricated, the basic core of his testimony was, in Kevin's view, still valid, which I find a ridiculous statement, but that may just be me. Since Kaufman's death in February 2001, researchers gained access to his papers and found some disturbing documents. Frank, it seems, was wont to forging documents to support the tales he was spinning for Roswell researchers. For instance, Frank claimed to have special intelligence training, high military rank as a master sergeant, and military assignments in the forces that seemed to indicate that his claims of special duties in Roswell were valid. To reinforce his claims to researchers, Frank produced a photocopy of one of his separation papers, the separation qualification record, that appeared to back up his story. But he would never allow the researchers more than a glance and refused to allow them to keep a copy. This, in of itself, might tend to raise suspicions, but his gift for the gab apparently smoothed over any objections the researchers might have had. After Frank's death, his widow allowed researchers access to his private papers. It was in these papers that the real forms were found, and the real truth finally came out that he had falsified his records to the researchers. The conclusions that had been drawn by Randall and the investigators were obvious, that Frank Kaufman had for the last 10 years been gulling the Roswell researchers with lies, forgeries and tall tales. The day after Roswell, 1997, former Lieutenant Philip J. Corso reported in his autobiographical book that the Roswell crash did happen, and that when it did happen, he was assigned to Fort Riley in Kansas. In July 1947, 5 trucks of 25 tons and some semi-trailers entered the base from Fort Bliss in Texas. He claimed while he was patrolling the base, he was brought into the medical facilities by Sergeant Brown and shown the remnants of bodies that were from an air crash. Philip Class analysed his claims line by line and exposed many inconsistencies and factual errors. Now, with Philip Corso, he sort of purported that if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have had silicon chips and fibre optics, because these were the things that he'd sent out to sort of military contractors and basically said, work on this stuff, send it out there, make what money you want off it, but make sure whatever you get from it comes back to us.
So let me just interject here. This is the first kind of breaking of ranks from the government establishment and from the military. This is the first person directly involved per se that has said something about Roswell, tried to give his version of what you would call the truth, beyond, of course, Mr. Kaufman.
Yeah, but if you actually look at the bottom of the book here, what's on the screen, it says forward by Senator Strom Thurmond. And if you read that, you sort of think, oh, wow, this guy's actually sort of saying what Corso's saying is real. But it wasn't actually the case. What if you actually read between the lines, what basically had happened is that if you look at it, and Strom Thurmond has pretty much said so, that he did send a forward through for the Day After Roswell book, which was then quickly edited by whoever to make it look as though it filled in with what happened in the Day After Roswell, because Strom Thurmond actually turned around and said none of this actually happened.
Okay.
And that's that slideshow finished with.
Okay, so for nothing for decades, there was not a lot of information coming out. It had gone quiet, but then the stuff did start to come out. Jesse Marcel later recounted or made public, started to talk about what he had actually seen publicly. The things have changed. Like I said, the wall of silence had started to come down. With him being such a big player and willing to talk about his experiences, the description of the materials that he held, the knowing that he was being silenced, knowing that he was being made a scapegoat, and he did start to become very vocal about this.
Yeah, but I mean, if you think about it, what he said and also what a lot of other people said, it does become a case of that there was a lot of problems within the accounts of many of the witnesses. I mean, obviously, Jesse Marcel, he said that, the material may have looked like tinfoil and balsa wood, but that's where the resemblance ended. They took one picture of me on the floor, some of the less interesting metallic debris. The stuff in that one photo was pieces of actual stuff we found, not a staged photo. So that in itself changes over from what Marcel said. First of all, he says that the debris was switched. And then in another statement, he turned around and said, actually, it wasn't. That was stuff that we found. they're saying that the material that Roswell put, he positively identified it as the material recovered. And this is where everything starts to fall apart, because it seems like one story is said, and then when you start to buy into it and tie into it, then it changes again. I could go for the story that he originally said, that the debris was switched, and that when he walked in, he sort of goes, "Hey, what's going on here? This isn't what we brought in." And allegedly they were supposed to say, "No, when you're interviewed, this is what you found." But then for later on to sort of say, well, actually, the stuff that was done, it did look like tinfoil and balsa wood, but it wasn't. So it doesn't really make any sense. And this is the problem with Roswell. You either have to have a leap of faith one way or another. And it's scary to do that, because I'd like to believe that something has happened, but I don't want to do it just off the testimony of what people have said, because I don't feel like a lot of the testimony of the main players is truthful.
Yeah, I absolutely understand what you're saying there. I mean, and now after this, everything coming out, the US government, the United States Air Force, obviously felt compelled then to give their version of events, to try and squash it once and for all, to try and squash any kind of rumors. And they released a publication which gave their version of events, their explanation of what was seen, their explanation of alien bodies and why these were seen. And to be fair, they did try to go in depth into it, as much as to a lot of people's chagrin. They did try to give what they considered to be an account that the public would swallow, that people would believe, didn't they? And this was 1994, was it?
Yes, it was. And unfortunately, this is, how can I put it? I'm trying to find the right words for it. This was when it all started falling about for a lot of people, because they were, like I say, from the original book in, 1980, when people read this and thought, you know what, there's something to this. But it's like everything, you know, when you get a story and it sounds good, and then it's like people think, hey, yeah, this sounds good. Let me add a bit to it. Let me add to it. And then by the end of you've got all people adding to it, it no longer becomes a factual story. It becomes a storyteller's story. And all those little bells and whistles that have been attached to it make it something which is so no longer factual that you don't want to be associated with it.
So do you think, Nodge, that an element of Chinese whispers starts to creep in now? Is there's so many people want a piece of the pie that like I said, the USAF do want to give their spin on it, to try and look, this is it, done. We've drawn a line under it. This is now done and dusted. This is what actually went on. Do you think that the Chinese whispers sort of overran to the extent where no matter what the government tried to put out there as being factual was always going to be just cast aside anyway? Or whether the USAF, with their publication that came out in 1994, Case Closed, I believe it was called, is factual, and that they were right in doing so?
Possibly. I think what happened in the interim was that the public perception of government and the military in particular changed. So it wouldn't have mattered at that point what USAF said about, you know, Project Mogul or you know, weather balloons or anything. It would not have mattered. Nobody would have believed it. And this is what's changed. I mean, you know, my parents and grandparents trusted what the government said and never questioned it. I think you and I, in our generation, you know, people who were, you know, late boomers, early millennials, wouldn't believe a word that we were told for the very same reasons, insofar that we know exactly what governments are capable of. So I think what happened by that point is Pandora's box was open and there was no way to put the lid back on. You know, I honestly believe I don't know much, but I do know a little bit about the way that governments think and the way that they try to control people. And let's be honest about this, governments do try to control people, and particularly their own populations. I think what has happened is that there was so much misinformation put about, and some of it, I'm convinced, was by the governments of the time and later in the United States. There's a thing in legal circles called an orgy of evidence. Now, Carl Flock himself, you know, a very, very well-respected researcher, has said that Roswell was ultimately a triumph of quantity over quality. In other words, there were a lot of narratives that didn't link together, and very often what happens in historical revisionism is that people will put, fact A and fact B and fact C, or theory A and theory B and theory C together, and make a convincing and cogent narrative out of something that didn't necessarily link together. So I think that's what's happened in the interim.
Yeah, which is so the truth becomes a victim. Ostensibly, the truth is always a victim of circumstance.
Well, the truth is a relative concept, and it's a relative concept to government, but it's also a relative concept to unreliable witnesses. There are two sets of villains here. There are the government agencies that basically threaten and cajole and try to shut people up, but there are also unreliable witnesses that come forward for their own gain. And every man, woman, child, and dog wrote a book about Roswell at some point, and this was my point about the bandwagon effect. I like Steve, I keep an open mind, but there's no doubt that people climbed on the bandwagon. I won't even get into Bob Lazar because that's for another night. But
that absolutely will be for another night.
But the fact of the matter is that the truth is often a casualty in these things, tragically, and very often it's attacked from multiple angles. And
there we have on screen the United States Army Air Force truth. Steve, do you want to go with this?
Yeah, certainly. This is I've tried to make this as short and sweet as possible because, as you know yourself, projects mogul. That's a new one. That anyway. Balloon arrays themselves are made of multiple balloons and rowing radar targets. The balloons are made from neoprene, flimsy, easily ripped and discolored in the sun. They were standard weather balloons, just like those launched 4 times a day by the weather department of Roswell. So people saw these things coming out of Roswell all the time. So to turn around and say, "Oh, it's just a weather balloon," people on the base obviously knew what they were. People in the vicinity also knew what they were because they'd seen them so often. Which is that they were something so easy to recognise because they were so common. Not so quite so common with the rowing radar targets, but they were nothing new and nothing extraordinary. They were made of easily snapped balsa, cloth-boxed aluminium foil and string, all materials with which soldiers would have been familiar. In fact, many standard meteorological packages were made of one balloon and one rowing radar target. Mogul was made of multiple balloons and multiple targets, but that shouldn't have been so extraordinary that no one could have recognised it for what it was. Skeptics have said there was huge secrecy regarding these balloons, yet skeptics and debunkers refuse to understand is that the balloon launches in New Mexico, the equipment used and the science being conducted were not classified. Charles Moore, one of the project scientists, stated they had travelled to Roswell to ask for assistance in tracking one of their balloons. They had met with the officers at the base, explained what they were doing and asked for assistance. Colonel Blanchard, the commanding officer, refused. The base was not going to offer any help at all for chasing balloons. The balloon launches were announced in advance in NOTAMs, and that's the notice to airmen, because the long arrays and clusters of balloons could be a hazard to aerial navigation. So the officers and soldiers at Roswell had a second way of learning about these balloon flights. All they had to do was read the NOTAMs. These NOTAMs would have described the nature of the hazard, or in the world of secrecy, compromised the project one more way. So what was classified? The ultimate purpose of the project? The stated purpose, the one that everyone knew, was to create a constant level balloon, one that could sustain a certain altitude. Prior to this, balloons were at the whim of the atmosphere, rising and falling as the sun heated them or the night air cooled them. The Japanese in their balloon bomb campaign took this into account, rigging a system of ballast with a barometer that would release the sandbags as the balloons dropped below a certain altitude. The purpose of the project wasn't classified. The ultimate purpose, to launch these constant level balloons and send them over the Soviet Union to spy on their atomic programs, was classified. The men working in New Mexico probably didn't know that. All they knew was that they were trying to keep the balloons at a certain altitude for a certain length of time. What this means is that Mac Brazel should have recognised the balloons for what they were when he found them. He did tell the reporters in Roswell that he'd found weather balloons on other occasion, and this was nothing like it, except if it had been Mogul, it would have been exactly like that, weather balloons and radar targets. This also means that Major Jesse Marcel Sr. should have been able to recognise the debris as a weather balloon rather than believe it's something truly extraordinary. If we're to believe the tale told by Sheridan Cavett, who did recognise the debris as a balloon, but didn't bother to say anything to Marcel, who was on field with him, to Blanchard, who was the base commander, or to anyone else, Cavett kept the information secret, so that these were weather balloons, even after Brigadier General Roger Ramey in Fort Worth had identified them as such. So this idea that Project Mogul was highly classified and therefore would be unrecognisable to the soldiers at Roswell is refuted. That's by the tracking of Mogul flight officers by officers at Alamogordo, New Mexico. While the purpose was highly classified, the experiments and equipment were not. And since the project was reported in the newspapers of July the 10th, 1947, this idea that the government was hiding the project can also be refuted. There is no reason for the extraordinary steps taken to cover up the incident in Roswell, unless it was something else other than Mogul. And Mogul certainly wasn't nearly as important as that new information. And this doesn't take us to the extraterrestrial, but certainly moves us away from Mogul.
Okay, so Project Mogul dealt with there as an explanation, and now we're moving on to the explanation, or rather the excuse for the reason for the sightings of alien bodies and for aliens in general. This is a good one.
Oh yeah, this is fantastic, that you can actually turn around and say that the bodies on site were actually down to ATDs, anthropomorphic test dummies, better known as crash dummies. So let's have a look. Let's find my notes on it. Just 1 second. I guess. Come on.
You would think it would have a little bit more, a little bit more creative than this. This is one of my favourite parts of the entire Roswell lore.
Oh, definitely. I mean, in July 1994, the Air Force report, which we'll talk to sort of later, was saying that they did find material at Roswell, but of course, it also came to actually turn out to be a weather balloon. But they said that people had reported about alien bodies being seen. Now, contrary to the allegation, the Air Force engaged in a cover-up, possessing dark secrets involving Roswell claims and some of the accounts. What they did turn around and say was that things had been happening in Roswell and stuff which was highly secret, but eventually would come out, which apparently they did. The aliens observed in the New Mexico desert were probably anthropomorphic test dummies that were carried aloft by US Air Force high-altitude balloons for scientific research. The unusual military activities in the New Mexico desert were high-altitude research balloon launch and recovery operations. The reports of military units that always seemed to arrive shortly after the crash of a flying saucer to retrieve the saucer and crew were actually accurate descriptions of Air Force personnel engaged in anthropomorphic dummy recovery operations. Claims of bodies at Roswell Army Air Force Base Hospital were most likely a combination of two separate incidents. One, a 1956 KC-97 aircraft accident in which 11 Air Force members lost their lives, and two, a 1959 manned balloon mishap in which 2 Air Force pilots were injured. Now, I'm getting a bit old and I do forget things, but I do have a rough idea and approximation of dates of things that happened, and somehow something like a 9-year distance or a 13-year difference in dates certainly sort of, for me, seems a little bit of a stupid thing, but never mind. For many years, crash test dummies have been used, and it's a better alternative than throwing an actual person out of an aircraft thousands of feet up. During World War I, research and development of the first US military parachute was underway in McCook Airfield in Ohio. To test the parachute, engineers experimented with several types of dummies, settling on a model constructed of a 3-inch hem rope with sandbags with the approximate proportions of a medium-sized man. The new invention was soon known by the nickname Dummy Joe. Dummy Joe is said to have made more than 5,000 jumps between 1918 and 1924. In 1949, the US Air Force Aeromedical Laboratory submitted a proposal for an improved model of the anthropomorphic dummy. The anthropology branch of the Aeromedical Laboratory at Wright Field was requested to review anthropological, orthopedic, and engineering literature to prepare specifications for the new dummy. Plaster casts of the torso, legs and arms of an Air Force pilot were also taken to assure accuracy. The result was a proposed dummy that stood 72 inches tall, weighed 200 pounds, had provisions for mounted instrumentation, and could withstand up to 100 times the force of gravity. So in 1949, a contract was awarded to Sierra Engineering Company of Sierra Madre, California, and deliveries began, remember this date, in 1950. This dummy quickly became known as Sierra Sam. In 1952, a contract for anthropomorphic dummies was awarded to Alderson Research Laboratories, incorporated in New York City. Dummies constructed by both companies possess the same basic characteristics: a skeleton of aluminium or steel, latex or plastic skin, a cast aluminium skull, and an instrument cavity in the torso and head for the mounting of strain gauges, accelerometers, transducers, and rate gyros. Models used by the Air Force were primarily parachute drop and ejection seat versions with central gravity tolerances within 1/4 of an inch. Now we get to the heart of the matter. The Air Force's rationale for believing that Roswell's alien bodies were nothing more than dummies. The report states over the next several years, the two companies improved and redesigned internal structures and instrumentation, but the basic external appearance of the dummies remained relatively constant from the mid-50s to the late 60s. Dummies of these types are most likely the aliens associated with the Roswell incident. Now, considering they're saying it was from the mid-50s to the late 60s, am I wrong in saying that the Roswell incident actually happened in 1947, and therefore what was being said was actually a load of tosh?
Yeah, the timing's well out there by a good decade at the very least.
It certainly is. And, you know, that's by their own admission that in the report done for the Roswell incident by the government in 1994. Just trying to find some more information on that for you.
Okay, well we're burning time a bit. So we've got the fact that they've explained Project Mogul as being the responsible for finding the debris, and polyanthropomorphic test dummies for being responsible for these reports of alien bodies being found, and a live alien being found and being seen at the hospital was portrayed as being a test officer, a test pilot that had his head squashed against the floor by the gondola of a test balloon, I believe.
All sorts of stuff like that. They were saying that it was perhaps monkeys that had been shaved and had been part of a V2 launch, which there was no V2 launches at the time. Plus, they didn't shave monkeys apart from certain parts of the skull where they used to put, like sensors on the head and stuff like that. They're saying it was like a pressurized, when the rocket depressurized and it made the skull expand or whatever. There was all sorts of daft things like that which was thrown forward. But I've never known of a crash test dummy to be able to walk into somewhere, which some of the people were saying that one of these aliens actually did walk into the airbase, and I've never seen a crash test dummy do that. But by the same token, a crash test dummy that was used in the mid-50s would have had to have time travel backwards to 1947 to pop up. So either the American government aren't letting on they've got time travel either, but that may just be me.
So, what do you think, Nodge? Do you think the USAF were willing to put forward that hypothesis because they just assumed they thought that the American public and indeed the world public later on, because we're dealing with the 90s here now, would readily swallow such a description. They would readily accept that what they were being told was being the absolute truth, and what was being seen is crash test dummies. It is a rowing sond weather balloon. It is Project Mogul.
I think there's an assumption on the part of USAF and the US government that the public will believe what they're told, no matter how ludicrous. I think that's the first thing I would say. I think the other thing is by that point, I contend and continue to contend that it doesn't matter at this point what the government say, because nobody's going to swallow it anyway. I mean, Steve's quite clearly pointed out the inconsistencies in what the government agencies have said about the bodies. I mean, I won't get into that in any detail, but I think what's happened there is that the US government in particular has really misjudged the mood of the public, and also the fact that the public no longer trust what they're told anyway.
Yeah, and that's always going to be the case. There's always going to be the paranoia. There's always going to be the distrust, because we're just treated, or the people are treated as not needing to know anything. They needed to be controlled. Now, after the report from the United States Air Force doing this book, giving this explanation, there was also then rumors of a video circulating, which became very, very famous.
God,
for a short while, this was the baby of a lot of ufologists that wanted to believe without any kind of shadow of a doubt. When they saw this completely validated the reports of alien beings. This was fantastic. It was black and white. It looked realistic, but it wasn't all that it seemed. It was the Ray Santilli video.
It was absolutely. Somebody once said to me, if something looks too good to be true, then it is too good to be true. And, you know, you could sort of see straight away that the way this video had done, that it was quite obviously staged by the way that even on the clock, it had 10 to 2, which is something that photographers use when they do take a photograph. I don't know, it's supposed to be something which sort of like gives an idea of how things look within a photograph so they can use it. I'm not a photographer, Nodge could probably answer that bit. The Ray Santilli video was an absolute joke. He said that he turned up, there was an American airman who'd been in touch with him and said he'd got this piece of film footage and that he would need to have a look at it. But he wanted a lot of money to hand it over. And the story goes that the money was handed over, they got this film, and this is what was put out. But basically, Ray Santilli and his mate got a few bits of like sheep's guts and a few mates to make this model studio, which Ant and Dec, which are still considered to be the most unfunniest people on the planet, but actually made a film about it and how it was made. And Ray Santilli, to this day, he still turns around, he says, you know what? The film footage was actually real, but it was that much falling to bits that we couldn't show it. So what we did was we made a reconstruction of it, which if they would have come out in the first place and said, like, you know, this is a reconstruction of what we've been shown, here are the shards of footage which we've got, unfortunately not showable, but you can at least have a look at them. But what we managed to see is this. Perhaps people may have held a little bit of credence with it, but to actually try and get away with what he did and the amount of money he milked off that and the amount of people who fell for it, like Heyman was saying, and, you know, some famous researchers that we know ourselves who fell for it hook, line and sinker. And when we turned around and said, hang on a minute, we were called every name under the sun. But, you know, it was an absolute joke. And I think that, along with the recent so-called pictures of Roswell, again, Heyman was saying, I don't know whether he's in the pocket of somebody or he just likes making a little bit of money, I don't know. But it all seems to stem that all this thing is going forward and it's all money orientated. And because of this is where the truth, unfortunately, is going to fall short, because as long as money changes hands, then the truth is not going to be actually seen.
And this is where the media bandwagon effect really is.
Exactly. It is.
A skeptical point of view, but to be honest, too many people like Santilli actually climbed onto the bandwagon. You don't need to be an optical expert to know that it was a pile of trash, because I mean the guy basically admitted it, and it ended up in, what was it, alien autopsy.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing was you did have people who were sort of like forensic scientists conducted autopsies who were saying like, oh yeah, you know, this is true, this is how you would do this, and yet other ones were saying this is nonsense. So it did divide a lot of people.
Absolutely, but I tell you what, Steve, in certainly in my career, I've seen a lot of very, very clever people fooled by something that was later proved to be wrong and stupidly wrong. Because if you put together a convincing enough argument without the verifiable evidence behind it, people can only go off the validity of what they're seeing before them, and very, very clever people can be very, very gullible.
Well, it's like Himmler, or was it Goebbels said, tell a big enough lie and they'll believe it.
That's exactly right.
So this then leads us to a very valid point, I think, is that does the Ray Santilli video, not that in itself, but the Ray Santilli video and other media portrayals of what actually happened at Roswell, does it do more harm than good? Does it harm the story? Does it put out a massively over-dramatized portrayal of what really happened on that day in July 1947?
Yeah, it sensationalizes it. And I'll give you a good example. In recent times, if you've been following anything to do with the UFO subject, the American government has basically turned around and said, yeah, there is such thing as an unidentified flying object. We just don't know what they are. Now, for many years, we've watched documentaries banging on about how much the American government, they're hiding this, they're hiding that, and they're hiding the other, and how great that the people in the realms of ufology are going out there to try and do it. Now, I've been watching some documentaries recently, and it's entirely the other way now. What comes on is they'll show a UFO video, sometimes a classic case like Betty and Barney Hill or something like that, and they come on and they'll say, but is this actually true? Is this actually what happened? And they're going the other way now. It's like, yeah, we've possibly got some form of proof, but now we need to go the other way because people are no longer interested. I mean, we've said for years, that this is what's happened, this is what's happening out there, this is what could be going on in the skies above us. We could come out and create a channel or a TV show called We Told You So. It's as simple as that. But now, because we are being told it's a possibility, the media have turned it on its head and turned around and said, actually, this could be a load of trollop. Where do you win? The media, at the best of times, is a whore to itself. And, I know that because I've worked in within the media, and I know just how much it does swap and change to suit a purpose for itself.
The media then, Nodge, you think this is, it's been a powerful vehicle for many years. The people have trusted the media. Now, recent events, which obviously is no point in discussing them here, I'm sure in a future one maybe, but the media is a massive, powerful tool. Are people seeing through that now? Are people seeing that it is as fickle as it's obviously leaving itself exposed to be?
I think when we talk about media, we need to separate the channels involved, because in the past, what we talked about was authoritative printed media, and then we were talking about broadcast media. I mean, Steve mentioned before, the Orson Welles thing. The fact is that the media is changing. I mean, you, Steve, and I are broadcasting on a very new form of media. The media has splintered and become something else. I think also you're absolutely right. I think I won't dwell on this, but if you think about the way that the media are covering the pandemic, you can see that the way the wind is blowing, insofar that the media and vested interests and large government agencies have effectively become synonymous and reliant upon each other to shore up their narrative with regard to what's going on. I think in terms of Roswell, what's happened is that a lot of people have climbed on the bandwagon to the detriment of Steve's beloved discipline, ufology, because my fear is, and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, and please do tell me to shut up if I am, my fear about Roswell is it's become a cliche. And my fear is I'm interested from a scientific point of view with regard to the validity of alien visitation in terms of verifiable evidence, but also, the realms of possibility. My fear is that Roswell's become a bit of a cliche, and that all future UFO sightings, case and research will live and die by what a lot of people think about the witnesses and hangers-on that Roswell has generated, people like Lazar and Zeta Reticuli and Element 115 and missing degrees and all that stuff. It's my fear that the media have fed into a culture of misinformation and this orgy of evidence and the revision of some very dodgy narrative elements that will discredit everything we try to do in the future.
But you get that in whatever happens. I mean, I wouldn't say that Roswell has just become a cliche. It's become a cottage industry. Yep. There's money to be made in it. There's T-shirts to be sold. There's museums to go in and see. I mean, for God's sake, there was one in Blackpool not so long about which looked like something like a tinfoil UFO with a body at the side of it. What people were paying like £5 to go and see. The problem with it is whenever you get something which is of an interest to a minority group like ufologists or people like ourselves, you will find that they try to milk it for as much as you possibly can. Rendlesham Forest, which I hope we cover at some point, that's another case as well. I mean, that's been done to death. And the sad thing about all that is you get all these famous cases, and you get all these famous people then coming out of the woodwork propounding it and then knocking it back and propounding it again. I mean, Nick Pope, for God's sake, how many shows does he appear on, that guy? It's unbelievable. And he makes out as though he's some kind of, proponent for the UFO side of it. Actually, it's the other way around. Nick Pope has made a lot of money off the back of ufology. I mean, the guy lives in California now. Yeah. So, this is the way it goes. This is the unfortunate thing of it all.
In the case of that individual, I'm only a layman, so I listen to what you guys tell me and try to look into that as best I'm able. But it's quite obvious, even to me, that somebody like Pope is basically just a mouthpiece and doesn't actually understand the first thing about the thing that he's supposed to do.
What he's me is he some form of disinformation? He sprouts all off this thing about going, I remember being in the governmental offices and I saw this and I saw that. Well, I remember years ago, in the days of when Gaynor Southall was running the MOD desk, and you could actually phone up and speak to her and say, look, this has happened. Can you log this? But at the same time, could you tell me if anything else comes has been sent into you? And invariably she'd say, well, actually, nothing's been in at the moment, but if you hear anything, I will get back in touch with you. When Nick Pope was on the desk, it was all like feed in, and you never got anything back. And all this stuff that he's been so-called researching, for me, I think it's bang out of order. And there's a lot of people who made a lot of money, a lot of fame, fortune, and everything else that goes with it off the back of people who actually do the actual research. But no, they sort of claw on it, and that's it. But that's just me.
That's exactly what I'm saying. It disturbs me that it has become as you put it, a cottage industry. That it has become a cliche, because to me, it debunks and devalues the great work that you do in terms of real research and real verification of evidence.
I've got to look at the likes of people like Leonard H. Stringfield and John King, absolutely fantastic researchers. Yep. The only thing that we've got in their name as a legacy is the books that they've done and documentaries that people have done about them. But them guys went out and they bust a gut, and people trusted them to give them the stories. Yet people nowadays, would you trust these people who pop up on TV and UFO hunters from ancient Peru and all the other crappy type shows that come on? Would you trust giving them a story? Would you trust opening up to them, to keep your identity? I wouldn't trust any of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so that's pretty much the broad outline, really, of the Roswell incident. We've nearly done 3 hours. I think it might be worth putting the floor open to some questions from the people that are watching, if they so wish to. So if you've got any questions for Steve, Nodge, or myself, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll deign to do our best to answer them for you.
Or if you pay me a lot of money, I'll just tell you whatever you want to know.
There's also that, which is a better idea, probably.
Oh, you tart, behave.
So any kind of questions from anybody in the chat that they might like to ask? There's obviously a lot of things that we've gone over in a short period of time and rather quickly, but with it being such a complex case, as Steve said before, we would be here all night and probably a day or two if we had to go into every little nuance regarding Roswell. Have we got any kind of questions? Can anybody see anything in the chat? I think we might have done okay with this one, guys. There's not a lot of people can say.
I can see get off, boo, and some about throwing.
Actually, I don't think they were trying to surprise us either.
We've got something there if you want to bring it in, Dave.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Asking Dave about if you could put our channel up. So anything that you can tell Beth about Tachyon, which is very much Steve's baby, but I also play with that'd be appreciated.
Okay, get to that soon. Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if Steve is working. What I'd like to ask, do you think the government could be testing weaponry or some form of craft that they need hiding at all costs, even aliens? Right. Okay. Paranormal people. I know that's a very broad standing gesture. Yeah, I do think that the government have been testing weaponry, and I can vouch for this quite certainly. I had a sighting myself in 1999 with a friend of mine. I used to do mobile DJing, and we were coming back from somewhere one night, and to quote Douglas Adams, we saw something very large, something very triangular, not less than a quarter of a mile from us, hanging in the air the same way that bricks don't. Now, straight away, seeing this, It seemed for about 10, 15 seconds. It rotated round, lit up at the back, and shot off ridiculously fast. Now, this thing, I don't think was alien. I think it was reverse technology, possibly the TR-3B, which has been blamed for most of the triangular sightings. And I do think within the next 5 years, we'll probably see this thing on the news as hailing as the fantastic new piece of weaponry. And it's probably been knocking around for about 20, 25 years. I mean, Dave was alluding earlier on about, secrecy and stuff like that. I mean, the F-17 stealth fighter, it was developed in secret and flown for decades while the public was told the aircraft was still on the drawing board. Project Ultra, the Allied World War II project that allowed us to break the codes of the Germans, it was secret for 30 years. And we've just been talking about Project Mogul as well. Charles B. Moore, who actually developed Project Mogul, never even knew the name of the secret project he was working on until 1992, and he'd been working on it since the 40s. Now, as far as the aliens go, I don't know. They possibly could be kept somewhere. I do think if there has any been found, it'll be at Wright Field or something like that. I think everyone that's going on about Area 51, I think that's been knocked into a cocked hat. I think everybody sort of knew that stuff was going on there and they moved it elsewhere. But I certainly do believe that the governments worldwide, British, American, whatever, they are testing weaponry which has been possibly reverse engineered from alien technology. And that's me. Lock me up, put me in a rubber room, but I do honestly believe that.
Okay, do you want to answer this one, Nodge? What do you think about that? If they still have debris, do you think they would investigate more?
That's a very good question. I suspect what's happened is they've divided the evidence that they've gained, and it's possible that they've split it up and stored it in various places. I think in terms of investigation, those investigations would be largely inconclusive insofar that any impact evidence is very often either vaporized or destroyed or fragmented to such an extent that it becomes impossible to do anything with other than make use of it as possible materials for future inventions. I think it is in the nature of investigators in general, and particularly anybody that's involved in forensic investigation, to try and make the most of the evidence that they have. So I wouldn't be surprised, Beth, if in the future some of this material winds up in other inventions and in other places.
So the chances are, of course, that we're going to see this. This is going to come out. It's just when they're willing to release it and how. Really, that's what we're dealing with.
But the stuff recently which have been released by the ATIP lot. I read a news article the other day in regards of somebody. I mean, Trump was going on the other week about, I know all the kind of things in an interview with his son. Some guy the other day said that they are quite close to releasing developments in regards of, and quote me on this, but I'm not 100% because obviously I don't do the news, but he said somewhere along the lines of there are vehicles that were made by non-humans that we have got in storage, and that apparently is going to be released, the details on that.
Absolutely. Dave, could I just pick up on the point that Fred's made, because
absolutely, yes.
As somebody with is currently going into another study of physics, astrophysics, and particle physics theory, I'm very interested in this, and the fact of the matter is, it's a good question, and we shouldn't try to conflate and confuse the incidents of UFOs, as important as they are, and the wider question about life in the universe. The universe is a very, very big place, and the fact of the matter is that every time we put a new instrument into orbit, it becomes bigger. Now, I read a cosmological paper not long ago saying that there's about to be another explosion in terms of our perceived measurements about the universe, and Fred's absolutely right. The chances of us being the only species to have gotten to an extent where we can perceive ourselves and the universe around us is almost nil. The universe will be teeming with life, but the problem is that no verifiable theory or evidence that has ever transpired from a UFO incident has actually proven that faster than light travel is possible. We've yet to prove it, and the same is true with antimatter and anti-grav. So yes, the universe will be teeming with light, but it is an awful long way away. It takes light, which travels at 186,000 miles per second, 4 years to reach us from the nearest star system, which is Alpha Centauri, so Proxima Centauri. The universe is a big place, and we don't understand the first thing about it yet. So, you know, it will get bigger, and our perception of it will get bigger. And undoubtedly, the universe is teeming with life. And the way that maybe advanced civilizations talk to each other may not be by radio waves at all. And there are other theories around this, you know, and it's not just about UFOs. It's also about the signal work that people like Carl Sagan and SETI did. And, you know, I think we're monitoring the wrong wavebands, frankly. And I think in the future we will find out more about the way that life permeates the universe by changing our instrumentation as well as our philosophy and scientific underpinnings.
Absolutely fantastic answer there, Nodge. Is there any more questions anybody would like to ask before we draw it to a close? I realise this has been a long one. I'm very thankful for everybody that have stuck with us throughout. If there's any more questions in the chat you'd like to put forward, please do. That would be absolutely fantastic. I'll give it a second or two. Realise this has been a grueler. Yeah, that's the thing. It's such a big topic. I mean, over the coming weeks there will be more broadcasts about ufology and conspiracy theories and lots of different things. And the choice for the Roswell one, it will be obvious to most people that have listened to it, I'm sure. It's a big one, it's well known, and people can relate to it. But there's many other topics we will cover. And like I say, a lot of them around some of the lesser known cases. And it'll be great, absolutely great to bat ideas about between us as we come round to those subjects over the coming weeks. Is there any more questions at all? Okay, I like this one.
I'm certainly up for it if you'll have me on anyway, definitely.
Here we go. There you go. Why don't you take this one first, Nodge? See what you think about this from Lindsay. For interstellar travel to be possible, you would have to bend space and time itself on a level that is incomprehensible by our standards.
I think Lindsay's got a point. I think if you look at c, the speed of light, in terms of, you know, E equals mc squared, the fact of the matter is there is a verifiable speed limit to the standard model that we have of the universe. If you look at the work that some of the quantum physicists have done on things like virtual particles, it seems to us like weird science fiction, and yet every single measurement that's ever been done of anything relating to core quantum theory that Richard Feynman and all those guys did has been verified. I agree entirely. I think standard straight line linear space travel between one place and another is not going to be the answer. I think that it is absolutely proven that Einstein, in the special and general theories of relativity, spoke about space-time being curved. It's been absolutely shown to be true. It's a mind-bending fact, but the fact is that gravity is not just the attraction between one body and another. It's an actual warping of space-time because of the disbalance caused by the presence of matter in the universe. And I think I agree with Lindsay wholeheartedly. It will not be a question of linear travel between point A and point B. If you travel from point A to point B on the globe, you're not traveling in a straight line. You're always traveling in a curved space anyway, because we live on an oblate spheroid, and the same is true in space-time. It is curved. We still don't understand the full ramifications of that in terms of the way that the universe is constructed.
Absolutely fantastic. That is absolutely bang on. Steve,
yes.
Are we limited by travel? Are we limited by our understanding of space travel as it is now? Our understanding of light travel as it is now? Are we dealing with travel over distance? Or are we dealing with travel over dimension? And there's the problem. It's interdimensional travel that we're actually witnessing, in not so much distance, a craft traveling through from point A to B.
well, I'm not as erudite as Nodge. I must admit, he's great with all the big words. I sort of just like have a look at stuff. But basically, I think for us to actually turn around and say, "Oh, this can't happen," I think we're just sort of judging the universe by our own limitations. Could you imagine if we could sort of like dip in and out of dimensions? I mean, I don't know if you've seen Guardians of the Galaxy, the bit when they do the warp drive in that, and they're doing like blop, 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 blop all over the place. Can you imagine being able to do that, like warp points between different dimensions to get to a point in space in a matter of minutes just by plopping from one place to another? And yeah, space-time is different. It's not just curved, warped or anything. I look at look at Dune when they're on about warping space there, and the great explanation they give about that, about a piece of paper. And they say, if you put an X on one side of the piece of paper and an X at the other end of it, and then fold it together, then it's not a distance between the ends of the piece of paper. It's as far as you fold it till they're touching each other, and then you move from there. It's just we haven't yet got the technology. There's nothing at all to say that other people haven't got the technology. Remember, we could be talking about civilizations that are millions upon millions of years in advance of ours. So for us to turn around and say, sorry, you can't do that, that'd be like us going back to a caveman and say, you know what, you can't light a match. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that 100%. And I am aware that the two are not mutually exclusive, interdimensional, and as well as physicality. Just that in the strictest its wording is that people think restricted by the physical form, being able to travel vast distances in a certain amount of time over a certain mechanical and engineering quotas that need to be met for this to be made possible. When is it really about dilation of time? Is it truly about interdimensional travel rather than distance travel? And that's the big question about it, isn't it?
Put it into the very small frame of reference that we've got at the moment. Now, if you were to go back 100 odd years ago and talk about flight, people would have been saying, oh, you can't do that. You need a lighter than air aircraft to do that, an airframe which would be lighter to do it. And then we come up with the physics to realise how it's done. And this is all it is for us to do these interdimensional, extrasolar, extra everything type travel. We need to come up with that physics. It's just a matter of time. It's like everything. We only know our limitations up to this point. Once we go beyond that, we can take that step further, and we need to keep taking these steps. And as long as we still think within these sort of like realms of, oh, we can't do this and we can't do that, we never will. But as a human race, we've always proved that we've never sort of held back and said, we can't do this. We've always proved that we can move that little bit forward. And I believe we can.
Nodge, is there anything you'd like to add to that point?
No, I don't think we're in disagreement, to be honest. I agree that, science is by its very nature an envelope of knowledge. And to be honest, every time we learn something new, I mean, we've only got to go back 400 years when we were thinking that the Earth was the center of the known universe. I agree. I think the way that science develops is it's iterative, and therefore, when we learn something new, not only does our knowledge move on, but so do the inventions that span from it. In terms of physics, string theory suggests that there are up to 8 dimensions that are basically, submicroscopic, subatomic, that play a big role in the way that the universe runs. But the fact of the matter is, we still haven't got enough knowledge to piece it all together. I maintain that linearity would not be the way that we will traverse the universe, and I'm pretty sure that it's not the way that anybody that visits the world would traverse the universe either. That there is support for it, for the interdimensional hypothesis, the IDH hypothesis, that plugs into the work of people that you may know, Dave, somebody like Mead Lane, who was a sort of parapsychologist and proto-ufologist in the early 20th century, who maintained that UFOs were not actually devices of locomotion across the stars, but were actually, came through interdimensional interstices that basically are congruent with our own. Now, that might sound like a mouthful of science fiction psychobabble. What that actually means is that matter can actually, come into being from from other places. And the fact of the matter is, we're not going to get there just by blasting a reaction rocket across the stars and hoping we'll get there. We'll have to do it by other means.
I think this is an excellent statement Steve's just made in the chat there. Don't look to the gutter, look to the stars. Now, it's been an absolutely fantastic night. It remains for me to say thank you to both Nodge, thank you to Steve, and thank you to everybody in the chat for joining in. Been absolutely fantastic. Very, very patient. Very, very understanding. Truly hope that you tune in the next time that we do a podcast, broadcast, whatever you want to call it, about whatever time. If you have ideas about topics as well that you would like us to discuss, please put them forward. Bearing in mind, none of us here claim to be experts. None of us here claim to be normal. With that said, I will say goodbye. I'll pass it over to Nodge.
Goodbye, everybody, and thank you so much for listening. It's been great to read all your comments. Look forward to seeing you all soon.
To Steve.
Yep, I just want to echo what Nodge just said. Thank you so much for your positive comments tonight. And look forward to doing another live stream with you again. You take care and God bless.
Okay, so thank you for listening. Hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't already done that. Spread the love. Subscribe to one another's channels. Spread the message. Make sure you click the bell icon so you get notification. Truly appreciate everybody coming round. Please watch out for the next cast. You've all been absolutely fantastic. We love you. Thank you and bye-bye.